Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I haven't told many people this. Actually, I haven't really told anyone. I figure nobody would believe me anyway. But I need to get this off my chest. And maybe someone here has seen something similar. This all happened back in 2014, when I was working as a bartender at this dive bar in Claremont, Wyoming. It's this tiny rural town where pretty much everyone knows everyone. I was barely making ends meet, living in this shoebox apartment above a hardware store. The place was so small, I could practically touch all four walls while standing in the middle of the room. One slow Tuesday night at the bar, I was serving this middle-aged woman named Mandy. She was a regular, but we'd never really talked much beyond the usual small talk. That night, she mentioned that she traveled a lot for work, some kind of consulting gig that had her on the road more than half the year. We got to chatting, and I mentioned how the landlord was raising my rent again, and I was thinking about moving somewhere cheaper, though options were limited in a town this size. "You know," she said, swirling her whiskey, "I've got this guest house on my property that's just sitting empty most of the time. It's nothing fancy, but it's a real house with a bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, the works." I must have looked skeptical because she added, "I'm serious. I've got 3 cats, and I hate boarding them when I travel. If you'd be willing to look after them when I'm gone, you can stay there rent-free." It sounded too good to be true, but I went to see the place the next day, and it was legit. The guest house was small, but way nicer than my apartment, and it was on this beautiful piece of land about 15 minutes outside town. There were woods all around, a creek nearby, and total privacy. The main house was about 100 yards away, and Mandy's cats were actually pretty chill. Mostly they just needed feeding and someone to clean their litter boxes. I moved in a week later. For the first couple of months, everything was perfect. Mandy was gone most of the time, and I had this peaceful little spot all to myself. The cats would sometimes hang out with me in the guest house, but they mostly stayed in the main house where I'd go to feed them twice a day. I started exploring the woods around the property on my days off. There were some old game trails that went pretty deep into the forest, and I'd follow them for hours sometimes, just enjoying being outside after years of mostly working nights and sleeping days. It was late August when it happened. I remember because it was unusually hot, and I was wearing this old Metallica t-shirt that was soaked with sweat by the time I got back. That day, I decided to go farther than I'd ever gone before. I packed a backpack with water, some trail mix, and a sandwich. I put on my earbuds and started listening to this true crime podcast while I walked. The forest was beautiful that day. Sunlight filtering through the leaves, birds chirping everywhere, that fresh pine smell in the air. I'd been walking for maybe 2 hours when the trail started to descend into this valley I hadn't seen before. I paused the podcast because I wanted to listen to the sounds around me instead. As I got deeper into the valley, I noticed something weird. There were these structures scattered throughout the area. At first, I thought maybe they were old hunting blinds or something that had collapsed, but as I got closer, I could see they were deliberate constructions. They were made of branches, some as thick as my arm, all woven together and reinforced with smaller sticks. Some had leaves and moss packed into the gaps. The strange thing was the size. These weren't little lean-tos or something a kid might build. They were huge, like big enough for several people to stand inside. One of them was easily 8 feet tall, with what looked like a doorway and even separate chambers inside. I'd never seen anything like it, and I couldn't imagine who would build something this elaborate out here in the middle of nowhere. I walked around examining these structures for maybe 20 minutes. There were 5 or 6 of them spread throughout the valley. all with similar construction but different sizes and shapes. Some looked newer than others. None of them had any trash or signs of modern tools being used. No nails, no rope, no tarps, just natural materials. That's when I first felt it. This weird sensation of being watched. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? It was like that, but stronger. I stopped walking and just listened. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence. I looked around but didn't see anything unusual. Still, that feeling wouldn't go away. I decided it was probably time to head back anyway, as I didn't want to be hiking in the dark. But before I could start walking, I heard footsteps, heavy ones, crashing through the underbrush somewhere behind me. I spun around and froze. About 50 yards away, an elk was stumbling through the trees. But not a normal, healthy elk. This thing was severely injured. Half the skin on its right side was just gone. Raw, red muscle exposed to the air. It was limping badly, its head hanging low, and it seemed barely able to stay upright. I was so shocked by the injured elk that it took me a few seconds to notice what was following it. Two dark shapes moving through the trees behind the wounded animal. They weren't chasing it exactly. More like following at a distance, keeping pace with its stumbling gait. At first, I thought they might be bears, but as they moved into a patch of sunlight, I could see they weren't bears at all. They were moving on their back legs and knuckles like gorillas, but they weren't gorillas. They were much taller, maybe 7 feet when fully upright, and covered in dark, matted hair. Their proportions were all wrong, arms too long, heads set directly on powerful shoulders with barely any neck visible. I couldn't see their faces clearly from that distance, and I didn't want to. Something about their movement was just wrong. Not like any animal I've ever seen. They seemed to be deliberately hanging back from the elk, like they were waiting for it to collapse on its own. In that moment, I felt a primal fear unlike anything I've ever experienced. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I was terrified that any sudden movement would draw their attention. Very slowly, I started backing away, trying to keep my eyes on them while also watching where I was stepping. I got about 10 feet back before my foot came down on a dry branch that snapped loudly in the silent forest. Both creatures stopped moving instantly and turned in my direction. I couldn't tell if they could see me, but I wasn't about to find out. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Branches whipped at my face, and I tripped several times but kept going. I didn't stop to see if they were following me. I just ran and ran, my lungs burning and my heart feeling like it was going to explode. I don't know how long I ran before I slowed down enough to look back. There was nothing behind me, just the empty forest, but I didn't trust that. I kept moving as fast as I could, trying to find the trail that would lead me back to the property. It took me hours to find my way back. I got disoriented in my panic and ended up taking a much longer route home than necessary. By the time I stumbled back onto the property, the sun was setting and I was completely exhausted. I locked myself in the guest house and collapsed on the couch, my whole body shaking. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it or that it was just some other hikers playing a prank. But I knew that wasn't true. What I'd seen wasn't human. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me jump. At around 3 in the morning, I heard something moving around outside the guest house, heavy footsteps circling the building, pausing occasionally as if listening. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, until whatever it was moved away. I stayed at Mandy's place for almost another year after that. I know that sounds crazy, but I didn't have many options financially, and I kept telling myself it had been a one-time thing. I never went back into those woods though, not ever. I'd take the cats outside sometimes, but I always stayed within sight of the houses. I never saw those creatures again, but sometimes at night, especially when Mandy was away and I was alone on the property, I'd hear strange noises from the edge of the forest. Not animal sounds I recognized, more like wood knocking against wood, or these low rumbling whoops that would echo through the trees. A few times I found strange arrangements of sticks and stones on the property, particularly after stormy nights. Things that didn't look like they'd fallen that way naturally. I never told Mandy about what I saw. I was afraid she'd think I was crazy or on drugs or something, but I did spend a lot of time researching online, trying to figure out what I might have seen. Everything pointed to one conclusion that I still have trouble saying out loud. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I know. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I'd have thought they were full of crap. But I know what I saw. The thing that really gets me even now is those structures in the valley. They weren't random. They were shelters built with intelligence and purpose. And the way those creatures were following the injured elk, not attacking it outright, but tracking it, waiting for it to weaken. That's not mindless animal behavior. That's hunting strategy. I moved away from Claremont about 2 years ago. Got a job bartending in a bigger town about 100 miles away. I still think about what I saw almost every day. Sometimes I convince myself that there must be a rational explanation, that my mind was playing tricks on me, or that I misinterpreted what I saw. But then I remember the absolute silence of the forest that day, the way those creatures moved, the structures that no human would have any reason to build out there in the middle of nowhere. And I know what I saw was real. I've never gone hiking alone since then. I don't think I ever will again. Some things you can't unsee, and some fears don't go away just because you tell yourself they're irrational. I still haven't told anyone else about this until now. I guess I'm hoping someone here might have seen something similar, or might have some explanation that makes more sense than I saw Bigfoot hunting an elk. Because even after all this time, I still have trouble believing it myself, but I know what I saw that day in the woods. And sometimes late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear those heavy footsteps circling my house, even though I now live in an apartment building on the 3rd floor. Story 2. I've been debating whether to share this for over 20 years now. Part of me still feels like people will think I've lost my mind, but I need to get this off my chest. Back in the fall of 1997, I experienced something that completely changed how I look at the world, and I still can't explain it to this day. I was 13 at the time, living in a western suburb of Indianapolis, Indiana. Our neighborhood was pretty typical, rows of similar houses with well-kept lawns, but we were lucky because just a 15-minute walk from our development was this amazing stretch of woods with a ravine running through it. It wasn't exactly a proper park, just undeveloped land that all the local kids treated like our own private kingdom. Every Wednesday after school, me and my friends had this tradition. We'd pool our allowance money, hit up the corner store for candy and sodas, then head to the woods to hang out until it got dark or our parents started blowing up our pages. This particular day, I remember it was a Wednesday in late October. There were more of us than usual. 8, maybe 9 kids. There was me, Ethan, my best friend Mike, his sister Katie, the twins Josh and Jake, Stacy, Derek, Chris, and I think Brendan was there too. We were all in 8th grade at Westlake Junior High. The weather was perfect that day. It wasn't cold yet, but the trees had started changing colors. The air had that crisp fall smell that's hard to describe, like dying leaves and wood smoke, and something else that only exists for those few weeks in autumn. We'd loaded up on the usual junk. I had my favorite Warheads and a cherry Coke. Mike had a giant package of Twizzlers, and everyone else had their own stash. We followed our usual trail into the woods, ducking under the branches of this massive oak tree that marked the entrance to our territory. About half a mile in, the ground sloped down toward a ravine with a small stream at the bottom. It wasn't deep, maybe 15 feet from top to bottom, but the ravine itself stretched for about a quarter mile through the woods. The stream was only a couple feet wide, but there were these smooth, flat rocks everywhere that were perfect for skipping. We made our way down to our usual spot, this small clearing by the stream where a fallen tree made a natural bench. We'd been there 100 times before. Nothing felt different or strange. We were just goofing around like always, comparing candy hauls, talking about homework, complaining about teachers. Jake had just gotten his first girlfriend, so everyone was giving him crap about that. After demolishing most of our candy, we moved closer to the water. Mike and Derek started competing to see who could get the most skips with the flat stones. I remember I was trying to find the perfect skipping stone when it happened. There was this thud. That's the only way I can describe it, not like a gunshot or a car backfiring, more like something incredibly heavy landing on the ground. The sound actually made the earth vibrate beneath my feet. All of us froze instantly. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered. None of us answered because we were all looking in the same direction, up toward the ridge on the opposite side of the ravine, maybe 40 yards away. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain kept trying to make sense of it, like, oh, it's a bear, or it's just some guy in a costume. But it wasn't either of those things. Standing at the edge of the ridge was... I still don't know how to describe it properly. It looked like a massive upright monkey, but that's not quite right. It was tall, way taller than any man I've ever seen. 7 feet at minimum, probably closer to 8. And it wasn't thin either. This thing was built like a linebacker, with broad shoulders and thick limbs. It was covered in dark hair, not black, more of a deep reddish brown like mahogany. The hair wasn't super long, but it covered everything except its face, palms, and what I could see of its feet. As we all stood there in shock, it raised its arms in the air and made this sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a yell, but something in between. The sound echoed through the ravine, and I swear I felt it in my chest. That's when I noticed there was another, smaller one next to it. Maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, with the same coloring but lankier. It was half hidden behind the bigger one, peering around at us. "Is that a fucking gorilla?" Chris whispered. "Gorillas don't live in Indiana, dumbass," Mike hissed back, but his voice was shaking. The big one made that sound again and took a step forward, still at the top of the ridge. It seemed agitated, like it was warning us. The smaller one, which I realized must be its child, seemed more curious. It moved out from behind the parent slightly, cocking its head as it looked at us. None of us moved. I don't think any of us were even breathing. I remember feeling like I was having an out-of-body experience, like this couldn't possibly be real life. The big creature kept making threatening gestures, clearly trying to keep us away from its young one. But the little one wasn't listening to its parent. It started moving down the ridge toward us, using the trees and rocks for support as it descended. The parent made a different sound then, softer but still forceful, like it was telling the kid to come back. But the young one kept coming. It moved weird, not quite like a human and not quite like an ape. It was incredibly agile, navigating the steep slope with ease, finding handholds and footholds without hesitation. I remember thinking that they must spend a lot of time in these woods to move like that. This wasn't new terrain for them. As the young one got about halfway down the slope, Derek suddenly let out this high-pitched scream that I still give him crap about to this day. It was so loud and so unexpected that we all jumped, and Katie actually fell backward onto her butt. The little creature stopped in its tracks, tilting its head like a confused dog. Then it did something I'll never forget. It smiled. At least, I think it was trying to smile. That's when I got my first good look at its face, and man, it was messed up looking. Its nose was crooked, like it had been broken and never set properly. Its lips were uneven, with the left side higher than the right, and when it opened its mouth, I could see it was missing several teeth. The ones it did have were yellowish and not aligned right. It wasn't like a human face, but it wasn't fully animal either. It reminded me of those creepy Halloween masks, but alive. The young one started moving again, and this time it seemed like it wanted to play. It would take a few steps forward, then stop like it was waiting for us to do something. "Guys, I think we should go," Stacy whispered, "like right now." But none of us moved. It was like we were hypnotized or something. The young creature was about 15 feet away when the smell hit us. Holy shit, the smell. Imagine the worst body odor you've ever encountered, mixed with wet dog, roadkill, and garbage that's been sitting in the sun for a week. It was so powerful and sudden that it broke the spell holding us in place. Katie actually gagged, and I felt my eyes watering. That's when the big one made its move. In one fluid motion, it launched itself from the top of the ridge and practically flew down the slope. I've never seen anything that large move so fast. It was beside its child in seconds, letting out these deep, guttural sounds that seemed to vibrate the air around us. We scattered like cockroaches when the light turns on. I don't even remember making a conscious decision to run. My body just took over. I scrambled up our side of the ravine, my fingers digging into the dirt, not caring that I'd dropped my backpack with the rest of my candy. I could hear everyone else crashing through the underbrush around me, branches snapping and people yelling. I glanced back just once. The large creature had grabbed the younger one by the arm and was dragging it back up the slope. It moved with this unnatural speed and grace, taking huge strides up the nearly vertical incline like it was nothing. Within seconds, they'd reached the top of the ridge. The big one paused for just a moment, turned to look directly at us, and let out one final bellow that seemed to shake the trees. Then they were gone, vanishing into the deeper woods. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the development. All of us were gasping for breath, covered in dirt and scratches. Stacy had lost a shoe. Chris had torn his new jeans. Jake had a bloody nose from running face first into a low branch. We stood there in a huddle, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "What the actual fuck was that?" Mike finally said, his voice still trembling. "A bear?" offered Brendan weakly, but none of us believed it. "Bears don't walk on two legs like that," Katie said, "and they don't have faces like whatever that was." "It was Bigfoot," Derek said firmly. "It had to be. My uncle's friends saw one in Oregon once." We debated for a while, standing there at the edge of the woods as the sun started to set. In the end, we made a pact not to tell our parents. They'd either think we were lying or they'd freak out and forbid us from going into the woods again. But we did tell other kids at school, and man, that was a mistake. By Friday, the story had transformed completely. According to the rumors flying around Westlake Junior High, we'd been chased by everything from an escaped zoo animal to a deformed homeless person to actual monsters. After a few weeks, people stopped talking about it, and eventually, most of my friends convinced themselves it had been something explainable. A bear, a large man, mass hysteria. We even went back to the woods a couple of times, though never to that exact spot by the ravine. But I know what I saw. Those weren't bears or people in costumes. The way they moved, that terrible smell, the inhuman sounds they made, it was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist in the suburbs of Indiana, but somehow does. It's been over 20 years, and I've never seen them again. I've gone hiking in those woods as an adult, half hoping and half dreading another encounter, but nothing. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, that parent and child, avoiding humans and living in the patches of wilderness that remain. Other times I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the smell, and that face, and I know it was real. I still can't explain what happened that day. None of us can. All I know is that the world is stranger than we think, and sometimes the monsters from our stories are actually out there, hiding just beyond the edge of our neighborhoods, watching and waiting. Story 3. It was July 12th, 1982. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week before my girlfriend Jenny's 18th birthday, and I was trying to figure out what to get her. I was 17 then, captain of the wrestling team at Northern Pines High School in Minnesota. The summer had been unusually hot, and that day was no exception. The heat was oppressive, hanging in the air like a wet blanket. I'd spent most of the day helping my dad fix our old Ford pickup truck. By late afternoon, I was covered in grease and sweat, but I'd promised Jenny I'd come over to help her dad move some hay bales into their barn. The Petersons lived on the other side of the woods from us, about 3 miles by road, but only about 1.5 miles if you cut through Ulma Sorensen's property. Now, everyone in town knew about old man Sorensen. He was a recluse who'd lived alone on his 100-acre property for as long as anyone could remember. There were all kinds of rumors about him, that he was a fugitive, that he practiced witchcraft, that he'd gone insane after his wife died. Probably all bullshit, but the man definitely valued his privacy. His land was surrounded by no trespassing signs. Some of them hand-painted with warnings like, "Trespassers will be shot." But I was 17, and 17-year-old boys aren't exactly known for making great decisions. Plus, I'd cut through his property dozens of times before without any problems. Sorensen's house was on the far east side of his land, and the path I took kept me at least 1/2 mile away from it. I figured I'd be fine as long as I stuck to the deer trail that cut through the densest part of the woods. I remember checking my watch before heading out. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon. I wanted to get to Jenny's by 5:30, which gave me plenty of time even if I took it slow. I grabbed my backpack with a change of clothes, no way was I showing up at my girlfriend's house covered in motor oil, and headed out. The woods were thick with pine and birch, and the ground was spongy with decades of fallen needles and leaves. It was cooler under the canopy, which was a relief after the beating sun. I'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I first got that feeling. You know the one, like you're being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I felt this pressure in the air, like right before a thunderstorm. I stopped and looked around but didn't see anything unusual, just trees and undergrowth. I figured it was just my guilty conscience about trespassing, so I kept moving. The deer trail narrowed as I got deeper into the woods, forcing me to push through some low-hanging branches. That's when I first heard it, a sort of shuffling sound like someone walking through the underbrush. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me. I stopped again, listening hard. The woods had gone weirdly quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just that shuffling sound, getting closer. For a second, I thought it might be Sorensen, and I was about to turn around and bail. But then I figured if it was him, I could just apologize and promise to go around his property next time. "Hello," I called out, not too loud. The shuffling stopped immediately. I waited, my heart starting to pound a little harder than normal. Then it started again, definitely closer now. Through a gap in the trees up ahead, I could make out what looked like a person coming toward me along the same trail. My first thought was that it was a kid. The figure wasn't tall, maybe 5'4" or so. A short, stocky man, I figured. Maybe one of Sorensen's relatives visiting or something. As we got closer to each other, I started to get a better look at him, and that's when I felt the first real stab of unease. There was something off about the way he moved. It was jerky, almost like a puppet being pulled by strings, and his proportions weren't right. His arms were too long, hanging almost to his knees, and his torso was barrel-shaped. I stopped about 20 feet away from him, suddenly not wanting to get any closer. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound casual. "I'm just cutting through to the Peterson farm. Sorry if I'm trespassing." The figure stopped too, just standing there, partially hidden by a pine tree. He didn't respond, didn't move, just stared at me. I could see him better now, and my stomach did this slow, sick flip. His face, Jesus, I'll never forget that face. It was covered in coarse black hair, not like a beard, but all over. His eyes were deep-set and completely black, like 2 holes in his head. His nose was enormous, almost like a snout, and when his mouth opened slightly, I could see yellowish, jagged teeth that didn't look human at all. It was wearing clothes, which is what really threw me, ragged, oversized overalls that looked like they'd been pulled out of a dumpster. But its feet were bare and covered in the same coarse hair as its face. They were huge feet, wide and flat with thick, dirty toenails. I'd like to say I was brave, that I stood my ground or said something clever, but the truth is, I was frozen, completely locked in place by a kind of fear I'd never experienced before. It was primal, overwhelming. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it made this sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a word. More like a guttural that rose from deep in its chest. That sound broke whatever spell was holding me in place. I started to back away slowly, not wanting to trigger it into chasing me. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm sorry, I'll go." That's when it rushed me. It moved so fast, impossibly fast for something with such a stocky build. 1 second it was 20 feet away, the next it was on me, tackling me to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I found myself on my back with this thing on top of me. The smell hit me then. A powerful, musky odor mixed with something rotten. Its face was inches from mine, those black eyes boring into me, that massive nose flaring as it sniffed at my face and neck. Its breath was hot and fetid, and I could feel spittle hitting my cheek as it made that strange grunting sound again. Pure terror had me in its grip. But something kicked in. Maybe my wrestling training, maybe just blind survival instinct. I bucked my hips and managed to get my right arm free. I shoved at its face, feeling the coarse hair under my palm, and twisted my body hard to the left. It was strong. God, it was strong. But I was pretty strong too back then, and I had technique on my side. I managed to flip it onto its back, reversing our positions. For a split second, I felt a surge of hope. I could get away from this thing. Then it happened. The thing that's made me question my sanity every day since. As I pushed myself up to run, the creature beneath me changed. There's no other word for it. It was like watching time-lapse footage of a plant growing, its limbs elongated, its chest expanded, its whole body just grew. In seconds, it went from being shorter than me to towering over me. What had been a 5'4" stocky figure was suddenly 6'2" and muscular, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was its eyes. As it transformed, they changed from black to a deep glowing red. And its mouth, God, its mouth opened so wide it seemed to split its face in half, revealing rows of those jagged yellow teeth. It let out a roar that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before, not human, not animal. It was deep and loud enough that I felt it in my chest, like standing too close to a speaker at a concert. I ran. I ran as fast as I've ever run in my life. I didn't follow the trail. I just crashed through the underbrush in what I hoped was the direction of the Peterson farm. Branches whipped at my face. Roots tried to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground, that terrible roaring sound getting closer. My lungs were burning, my legs were on fire, but pure terror kept me going. I have no idea how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and warp. At some point, I realized I couldn't hear it behind me anymore, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I broke out of the tree line and saw the Peterson farm about 100 yards ahead. I staggered up to their front door, probably looking like I'd been through hell. My clothes were torn, my face was scratched and bleeding from the branches, and I was hyperventilating so bad I couldn't speak when Jenny's mum opened the door. They brought me inside, got me some water, and tried to calm me down. When I finally could talk, I told them what happened. Well, a version of it. I said I'd been attacked by a man in the woods. I left out the part about it transforming. Even in my shocked state, I knew how that would sound. Jenny's dad and brother grabbed their shotguns and went out to look, but they didn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of a struggle where I'd been attacked. Nothing. By then it was getting dark and they drove me home instead of letting me walk back. My parents wanted to call the police, but I talked them out of it. What was I going to say? That I was trespassing on Sorensen's property when I was attacked by some hairy dwarf that turned into a giant with glowing red eyes. They'd have thought I was on drugs. The next day, I woke up with a high fever. My mum thought I was just in shock from the attack, but I was sick for almost a week, really sick, hallucinating, night sweats, the works. When I finally recovered, I tried to convince myself that the whole transformation thing had been part of my fever dreams. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to me in those woods. I never took that shortcut again. Not once in all the years since. About a month after it happened, curiosity got the better of me, and I drove down the road that borders Sorensen's property. His house looked abandoned, windows boarded up, yard overgrown. Someone in town told me later that he'd moved away suddenly, not telling anyone where he was going. That was 40 years ago, and I've spent most of my life trying to forget it. But I can't. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, feeling those black eyes staring at me, smelling that rotten, musky odor. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to get away. I've read about similar encounters over the years. Some people call these things Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but what I saw wasn't the giant ape-like creature from the Patterson-Gimli film. It was something else, something that could change its shape, something that wore human clothes and lived on the edges of human civilization. Sometimes I wonder if others from my hometown had similar experiences that they never talked about. Was that why people avoided Sorensen's land? Did they know something that they never put into words? I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, half the time I don't believe myself. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt under my hands when I pushed its face away. And I know that something impossible happened to me in those woods in 1982. I just needed to finally tell someone who might understand. Thanks for reading. Story 4. I still get goosebumps talking about this, even though it happened back in the summer of '86. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that night at Beaver Pond, but I'm not sure I ever will. It was July 1986. I was 16. Me and 4 friends decided to go camping in this remote spot in Delta County, Michigan, called Beaver Pond. Our group was me, Vincent, my buddies Mark and Jeff, and 2 girls from our class, Sarah and Lisa. We were just normal teenagers looking for a weekend adventure, nothing crazy. Mark's dad drove us out there in his station wagon. It was about a 2-hour drive from our homes, and he dropped us off at this logging road. We had to hike about 1.5 miles to reach the actual campsite. I remember it was hot as hell that day, and we were all sweating and complaining about the weight of our backpacks. But the excitement kept us going. The spot we picked was on this ridge that overlooked a small lake. It was pretty secluded, exactly what we wanted. On one side, there was a steep slope that dropped down to the water, and on the other side was this thick, swampy area with tons of trees and underbrush. It felt like we were the only people for miles around, which seemed awesome at the time. We set up our bright yellow tent. I remember it being this ugly mustard color that Mark's family had owned forever. We gathered wood for the fire, unpacked our stuff, and by late afternoon, we were pretty well established. The girls had packed sandwiches for dinner, peanut butter and jelly, nothing fancy, and we had a bunch of sodas in our cooler. We didn't bring any alcohol because Mark's dad would have killed us, though Jeff had snuck in a couple of cigarettes that we shared. Everything was totally normal as the sun went down. We got the fire going really well, and we were all just sitting around it telling stupid jokes and stories. I remember the mosquitoes were brutal, and we kept having to slap them away. Lisa had brought this crappy battery-powered radio, and we were trying to find a station, but the reception was terrible, so we eventually gave up. It must have been around 1:30 in the morning when things changed. Mark and Jeff were still up with me, but the girls had already gone into the tent to sleep. We were just chilling by the fire, which was starting to die down a bit, when we heard this sound from somewhere in the distance. It's really hard to describe it accurately. The closest thing I can compare it to is like a chimpanzee screech, but deeper and more, I don't know, guttural. It wasn't super loud at first. It came from the direction of the swamp, probably half a mile away or more. But something about it immediately made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't any animal sound I'd ever heard in the Michigan woods before, and I'd done plenty of camping and hunting with my dad. "What the hell was that?" Jeff whispered, and I could tell from his face that he was freaked out too. Mark tried to play it cool. "Probably just an owl or something," he said, but you could tell he didn't believe it. We sat in silence for a minute, straining to hear it again, almost hoping we wouldn't. But then it came again, and this time it was definitely closer, maybe 400 yards away, still from the swamp side. It was the same screech, but louder, clearer. I remember looking at my watch and seeing it was 1:45. The girls must have heard it too, because they poked their heads out of the tent. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. We all started throwing out suggestions. Could be a bobcat, maybe a fox. Jeff even suggested it might be coyotes, though it sounded nothing like a coyote. Deep down, I think we all knew it wasn't any of those things. Whatever was making that noise was big, and it was getting closer. We threw some more wood on the fire to keep it bright, and I remember regretting that none of us had thought to bring anything more than our pocket knives and my hunting knife. My dad would have brought his rifle, but we were just dumb kids. That's when we heard it again, and my blood went cold. The sound was now just about 50 yards away, at the base of the ridge near where the swamp started. It was so loud and so angry sounding. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since, like a mix between a scream and a roar, but with this weird modulation to it. "Should we go check it out?" Jeff asked, but there was no way in hell any of us were leaving the campfire. For the next 3 hours, I'm not exaggerating, it was literally 3 hours, that thing circled our campsite. It never came up onto the ridge, always staying at the base where the ground started to slope down, but it moved around us in a complete circle, from the swamp side around to the lakeside and back. Sometimes we'd hear branches snapping or undergrowth being pushed aside, like something really big was moving through the forest. Other times, it would go completely silent, and those moments were almost worse because we had no idea where it was. The pattern was messed up. It would screech from one spot, then a minute later, before anything could reasonably cover that distance, we'd hear the exact same sound from the opposite side of our camp. It was like there were multiple creatures, or it could move incredibly fast. Neither option was comforting. We tried shining our flashlights into the trees, but they were those crappy 80s flashlights with weak yellow beams that barely penetrated the darkness. The most we ever saw was the reflection of light off the underbrush. No eyes, no shapes, nothing definitive, just darkness and those horrible sounds. The girls were completely terrified. Sarah was crying quietly, and Lisa kept saying we should call for help. But of course, this was '86. We didn't have cell phones. We were completely on our own. If it was going to attack us, it would have done it already, Mark kept saying, but his voice was trembling. None of us believed him. It felt like it was toying with us, studying us, figuring out what to do. At one point, around 3 in the morning, there was this moment when all the normal forest sounds, the insects, the frogs by the lake, everything went completely silent. That's when I knew for certain we were dealing with something predatory. Animals don't go quiet like that unless they sense a serious threat. I remember gripping my hunting knife so hard my knuckles turned white. Not that it would have done much good against whatever was out there, but it was all I had. The worst moment came around 3:30. The thing had been quiet for about 20 minutes, and we were all straining to hear where it might be. Then suddenly, from directly behind me, maybe 30 yards down the ridge toward the lakeside, came this sound that was different from the screeches. It was lower, almost like a grunt or a growl, and it was followed by what sounded like heavy breathing. I swear I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. Whatever this thing was, it was huge. Jeff started saying the Lord's Prayer under his breath. I'm not even religious, but I found myself joining in. We were that scared. Around 4 in the morning, after what felt like an eternity, the sound started to move away. The screeching continued, but it was getting more distant, heading back deeper into the swamp. By 4:30, we couldn't hear it anymore. None of us slept. We kept the fire going as bright as we could and just sat there in a circle, backs to each other, staring into the darkness until the first light of dawn appeared around 5:15. As soon as it was light enough to see, we packed up our stuff in record time. We didn't even bother with breakfast or checking the area for tracks or evidence. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. We practically ran back to the meeting point where Mark's dad had agreed to pick us up at noon. We got there by 7 in the morning and just sat on our backpacks, jumping at every sound in the forest until his station wagon finally pulled up. Of course, when we told Mark's dad what happened, he just laughed. "You kids and your imaginations," he said. "Probably just a deer or maybe a bear sniffing around your food." But I know what bear sounds like. This wasn't a bear. We told our parents and a few other adults, but got the same dismissive response each time. "You were all hyping each other up," my mom said, "scaring yourselves with ghost stories." But we hadn't been telling ghost stories. We hadn't been trying to scare ourselves. We had been terrified by something very real that had stalked us for hours. About 2 years later, I was at my friend's house, and his older brother had this book about Bigfoot. There was a section with a cassette tape that had recordings of supposed Bigfoot calls from various parts of the country. When I heard the one from the Pacific Northwest, I nearly threw up. It was so similar to what we had heard that night at Beaver Pond. The same guttural quality, the same modulation in the screeching. I've gone camping many times since then, but never in that part of Delta County. I've never told this story to many people because it sounds crazy, and most people just think we were a bunch of scared teenagers letting our imaginations run wild. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's some logical explanation for what happened that night. But 37 years later, I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, convinced I've just heard that screech again outside my window. I still can't explain what circled our campsite for 3 hours, moving impossibly fast, making sounds no known Michigan wildlife makes. I still don't know why it never attacked us or what it wanted. All I know is that something was out there in the woods that night, something that shouldn't exist. And sometimes I wonder if it's still there, screaming in the darkness, waiting for the next group of campers to make the mistake we did. Story 5. I've been holding this inside for over 40 years now, and I think it's time I finally put it down in writing. I've only told a handful of people, and most reactions range from polite nodding to outright mockery. My own family still brings it up as a running joke at Thanksgiving, but what happened that day in 1982 in Beltrami County has haunted me ever since. It was November 12th, deer season in northern Minnesota. I was 27 then, hunting with my father and younger brother like we'd done every year since I was old enough to handle a rifle. The morning was crisp, maybe 25 degrees, with about 3 inches of fresh snow on the ground from the night before, perfect tracking conditions. We'd gotten up at 4:30, had our traditional pre-hunt breakfast at the little diner in town, pancakes, eggs, and enough coffee to wake the dead, and reached our hunting spot just as dawn was breaking. We'd been coming to this same general area for years. It was remote, thick with pine and aspen, and bordered the west branch of the Floodwood River. Good deer country. Dad had spotted a nice 8-pointer in the area during scouting trips, and we were all hoping for a shot at it. We parked the truck at the old logging access road, about a mile off the county highway. Nobody around for miles. Just the 3 of us, our rifles, and the silence of the woods. We geared up. blaze orange vests and hats, extra ammo in our pockets, thermoses of coffee. Dad went over the plan like he always did, even though it was the same one we'd used for years. Jacob, you take the river path heading southeast. Mark, we'll cross at the shallow point and set up on the ridge. If anything gets spooked your way, Jacob, you'll have a clear shot from that open area by the bend. We walked together for about 1/8 of a mile down an old trail, our boots crunching in the fresh snow. The forest was still waking up around us, a few birds starting to call, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. When we reached the fork, Dad and Mark headed right toward the river crossing, and I went left, following the west branch downstream. I moved slowly and deliberately the way Dad had taught us. 15 steps, then stop and listen for a full minute. Scan the woods, look for movement, watch for tracks. My Winchester .30-06 was loaded, but the safety was on. The woods were particularly beautiful that morning, the fresh snow clinging to the pine branches, the air so cold and clear it made your lungs ache a little. After walking about half a mile, I came to a small clearing near a bend in the river, perfect spot to wait for deer. The river made a natural funnel, and animals often followed the path of least resistance along its bank. I found a fallen log facing the clearing, brushed off the snow and sat down. The sun was fully up now, filtering through the trees and making the snow sparkle. I'd been sitting there maybe 45 minutes, occasionally shifting position to keep warm, when I got that feeling. Any hunter knows what I'm talking about. That sudden awareness that something is watching you. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly scanned the tree line across the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything. The woods looked normal, snow-covered pines, patches of bare aspen, the usual northern Minnesota forest. But then my eyes locked onto a spot about 60 yards away, in a stand of young pines. There was a face staring at me, not a deer, not a bear, a face. It was dark, almost black, and partially hidden among the pine branches, but I could clearly see 2 eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach drop. The face was large, broader than a human's, with a slightly pronounced brow. The eyes weren't wild animal eyes. There was something aware in them, intelligent, assessing. I froze completely. My rifle was across my lap, and I didn't dare move to raise it. Whatever was watching me hadn't decided what to do yet, and I wasn't going to provoke it. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, I got a better look as it shifted slightly. It had dark black shoulders visible now above the snow-covered underbrush. Its neck was thick, and the head was large and somewhat conical, not flat-topped like a bear's. The face was almost ape-like, but no ape I'd ever seen in books or at zoos. The skin or fur on the face was dark, and I could make out what looked like a heavy brow ridge. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. Then something changed. Maybe it decided I was a threat, or maybe it just lost interest, but it suddenly blew air forcefully out of its nostrils. I could see the vapor cloud in the cold air. The sound was unlike anything I'd heard before, not a snort like a deer, not a huff like a bear, but something in between. Then it turned, not like a human would turn, with a step and pivot, but in one fluid motion, its entire upper body rotating away from me, and then it was moving through the trees. I finally raised my rifle, more out of instinct than intent, and for a split second had it in my scope. I could have taken the shot, but what was I aiming at? I couldn't pull the trigger on something I couldn't identify. That's basic safety, and more than that, I had no idea what I was looking at. What I heard next still gives me chills when I think about it. The creature was moving away fast, not running exactly, but covering ground quickly. I could hear branches breaking, not like a deer crashing through underbrush, but purposeful movements, powerful, and then a sound that was almost like a low hum or growl, but so deep I felt it more than heard it. After it disappeared from view, I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples. I kept my rifle ready, scanning the trees, half expecting it to come back or circle around. Finally, I got up. I needed to mark the spot where I'd seen it. I took out my pocket knife and carved a deep X in the log I'd been sitting on, then looked for landmarks I could use to find this place again. There was a lightning-struck pine on the edge of the clearing that made a good reference point. I crossed the river at a shallow point 100 yards downstream, the icy water seeping into my boots despite my care. The cold barely registered. My mind was completely focused on getting to where the creature had been standing. As I approached the stand of pines, a group of ruffed grouse suddenly burst up from the snow almost under my feet. The explosive flutter of wings and snow made me jump back, my heart lurching as I nearly fell. In normal circumstances, I might have taken a shot at them. Grouse make good eating. But I was focused on something else entirely. Once I got my bearings again, I started searching the area where I'd seen the creature. The fresh snow should have made tracks obvious, but what I found confused me more. There were disturbances in the snow, but nothing clear. No defined footprints I could make out, just areas where the snow was compressed or disturbed. I spent nearly an hour combing that section of forest, looking for anything that might confirm what I'd seen. About 50 yards from where the creature had been standing, I found something strange. A trail in the snow that looked like it had been swept, as if something had been dragged along the ground, obscuring tracks. I followed this trail for about a quarter mile up to a ridge, but it eventually faded out where the snow was thinner under the denser tree canopy. By this time, I realized I needed to get back to our meeting spot. Dad and Mark would be waiting, and in the days before cell phones, there was no way to let them know where I was. I took a compass bearing and headed back toward the truck. When I reached our meeting point, they were already there, looking impatient. "Where the hell have you been?" Dad asked, his breath clouding in the cold air. "We've been waiting nearly an hour." "I saw something," I said, still out of breath from hurrying back. "Not a deer. I don't know what it was." "Bear?" Mark asked, immediately interested. He'd never shot a bear before. "No, not a bear." I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. It was standing upright, had a face almost like an ape, black, big. Dad and Mark exchanged a look I knew all too well. "Jacob, bears stand up all the time," Dad said slowly, like he was explaining to a child. "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "I've seen plenty of bears. This was different. It was watching me, thinking. Then it blew air out its nose and moved away through the trees." Mark started laughing. "Holy shit, Jake. You finally saw Bigfoot." "I didn't say that," I snapped, but I could feel my face getting hot. "So what are you saying?" Dad asked, his tone making it clear he thought this was ridiculous. "I don't know what I saw. That's what I'm saying. But it wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a deer." The ride back to the cabin was uncomfortable. Dad and Mark kept exchanging glances, and Mark made a few more jokes about me going on the Bigfoot hunting show that was popular back then. I stopped trying to explain and just stared out the window at the passing forest. That night at the cabin, after a few beers, Dad finally asked me more seriously about what I'd seen. I described it in detail: the face, the eyes, the way it moved, the sound it made. "Jacob," he said, "you know what black bears look like in winter coat. Their faces can look different depending on the angle. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the woods." "Dad, I know what I saw," I said, "and I heard it moving through the woods after. It wasn't crashing around like a bear. It was deliberate." "Well," he said, taking a swig of his beer, "whatever it was, it's gone now. Best leave it at that." But I couldn't leave it at that. The next day, I insisted on going back to the same spot. Dad and Mark humored me, though they made it clear they thought I was wasting hunting time. We found the log with my X carved in it, and I led them to where I'd seen the creature. The snow had partially melted in the morning sun, and whatever signs had been there were now obscured. Dad pointed out some disturbances that could have been from a bear, but even he admitted they weren't clear. Could have been anything, really, he conceded. Probably a bear that moved off when it smelled you. For the rest of the hunting trip, Jake's bear became a running joke. Every time we heard a branch crack or saw movement in the trees, Mark would whisper, "There's your buddy coming to say hi." By the end of the weekend, I stopped bringing it up, but I've never stopped thinking about it. Over the years, I've done research. I've found out that there have been other sightings in northern Minnesota, some within 50 miles of where I was that day. The area north and southwest of Floodwood has remote bogs, dense forests, small rivers and marsh lakes, the kind of terrain where something could stay hidden. I've talked to a few other hunters who've had similar experiences. Strange encounters they can't explain. Most won't talk about it openly for fear of ridicule. I understand that now. I don't know what I saw that day. I'm not claiming it was Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever name you want to use. All I know is that it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, and it certainly wasn't human. It was something else, something that looked at me with intelligence and awareness before deciding to leave me alone. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd taken that shot. Would I have proof of something unknown to science, or would I have killed a bear and convinced myself it was something more mysterious? I'll never know. What I do know is that the woods of northern Minnesota hold secrets. I've been back to that same hunting spot dozens of times over the years, always hoping for another glimpse, but never seeing anything unusual again. Whatever it was I saw that November morning in 1982 has remained elusive. My father passed away 8 years ago, still believing I'd seen a bear, and let my imagination run wild. Mark still brings up Jake's Bigfoot at family gatherings, treating it like a funny story from our youth. Most of the time, I just smile and shake my head now, but sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I still get that feeling of being watched. And I wonder if it's out there still, watching and waiting, as mysterious now as it was 40 years ago. Story 6. I've debated for years whether to share this story. It's about my dad, and something he saw back in October 1983 that changed him forever. I guess I'm finally writing this down because Dad passed away last spring, and I feel like his experience deserves to be known, even if most people won't believe it. Growing up in northern Minnesota near Moose Lake, strange stories were just part of life. We lived only about 40 minutes from the Canadian border, in a place where the wilderness still feels genuinely wild. But what happened to my dad and Uncle Bobby that autumn day was different from the usual hunting tales. I was only 11 years old at the time. Dad and Uncle Bobby had planned this hunting trip for weeks. They were after deer, and this particular spot near a small, unnamed lake was supposedly teeming with them. Dad knew those woods like the back of his hand, having hunted there since he was a teenager himself. I remember the morning they left. It was cold, maybe around 30 degrees, with that crisp October feel where your breath hangs in the air. Dad was wearing his red and black checkered wool jacket, the one Mom always said made him look like a lumberjack from a paper towel commercial. He had his lucky orange cap pulled down over his ears, and he seemed excited the way he always did before a hunt. "Be good for your mom," he told me, ruffling my hair as he grabbed his thermos of coffee. "We'll be back before sundown with dinner for the next month." Uncle Bobby was waiting in his old Ford pickup, engine running, exhaust billowing white in the cold morning air. They had their rifles secured in the back, along with enough supplies for a full day in the woods. I remember watching them drive away, not knowing that when Dad came back, something fundamental about him would be different. The day went by like any other Saturday. I played with my friends, helped Mom with chores, and watched cartoons. We expected Dad and Uncle Bobby around 5 or 6 that evening, which was normal timing for their hunting trips. When their truck finally pulled into our gravel driveway around 7:30. It was already dark. I ran to the window, expecting to see them hauling a deer from the truck bed. Instead, they just sat there, the engine off, not moving. Mum noticed it too. "What are they doing?" she mumbled, wiping her hands on a dishcloth as she peered through the kitchen curtains. After about 5 minutes, they finally got out. No deer, no excited recounting of near misses or the one that got away. They moved slowly, like they were exhausted or maybe in shock. When Dad walked through the door, his face was pale. His hands were trembling slightly as he hung his jacket on the hook by the door. Uncle Bobby looked just as shaken up. "Any luck?" Mom asked. Dad just shook his head, not meeting her eyes. "No, no, no," he muttered. Just that, over and over. "No, no, no." Mom looked at Uncle Bobby, who was staring at his boots. "What happened out there?" she asked. Uncle Bobby glanced at Dad, then at me. "Nothing," he said. "Just a long day, didn't see much." But I knew he was lying. Something had happened. Something bad enough that 2 grown men, tough men who'd faced blizzards and bears and all kinds of wilderness dangers, were shaken to their core. Dad barely touched his dinner that night. He kept staring off into space, occasionally shaking his head and muttering under his breath. Mom tried to get him to talk, but he just said he was tired and went to bed early. I didn't find out what happened until 3 weeks later. I was supposed to be asleep, but I'd snuck downstairs to grab a midnight snack. Dad and Uncle Bobby were sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey between them. They were talking in low voices, but I could hear them from where I hid in the hallway. "We have to talk about it sometime, Jack," Uncle Bobby was saying to my dad. "It's eating you alive." "What good would it do?" Dad replied. His voice sounded hollow. "Nobody would believe us anyway. I saw it too, clear as day, not 20 yards from me." 35 feet, Dad said. I paced it out after. 35 feet from where I was standing. There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of whiskey being poured into glasses. "It was at least 8 feet tall," Uncle Bobby finally said. "Maybe taller." 8.5 easy, Dad agreed. "And the smell. Jesus, that smell. Like wet dog and something rotting. And the way it moved through those trees, so fast but quiet. Something that big shouldn't be that quiet." My heart was racing now. What were they talking about? What had they seen? "Did you see its face?" Uncle Bobby asked. Dad was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "For just a second, when it turned. Eyes like a person's, Bobby. That's what gets me. Those weren't animal eyes." "Bigfoot," Uncle Bobby said plainly. "A Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. That's what we saw." Dad let out a long breath. "I've been hunting those woods for 30 years. Never believed any of those stories. But now we know." Uncle Bobby finished for him. I must have made some noise then, because they both turned toward the hallway. I darted back upstairs before they caught me, my mind reeling with what I'd heard. My dad and uncle, the most down-to-earth men I knew, were sitting in our kitchen talking about seeing Bigfoot. The next morning, I couldn't help myself. While Mom was in the shower, I cornered Dad at the breakfast table. "What did you really see in the woods, Dad?" He looked startled, then suspicious. "What are you talking about?" "I heard you and Uncle Bobby last night. You saw something big." Dad's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, anger, resignation, and finally, a kind of desperate need to unburden himself. "Sit down," he said quietly. I sat across from him, holding my breath. "What I'm going to tell you, you can't tell your friends at school. People will think we're crazy." He leaned forward. "You understand?" I nodded solemnly. We were about 2 miles in from where we parked the truck near that small lake with the rock outcropping on the north shore. "Know the one I mean?" I nodded again. He'd taken me fishing there a couple times. It was around 2 in the afternoon. Bobby and I had split up about an hour earlier. I was moving slow along a game trail, looking for signs of deer. It was quiet, really quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Should have been my first clue something wasn't right. Dad's hands were wrapped tightly around his coffee mug. I came around this big boulder and there it was, just standing there, middle of the path, looking the other way, thank God. Dad's eyes had a far-away look now, like he was seeing it all again. It was huge, covered in dark brown hair, almost black in places, standing on two legs like a man, but not a man, broader shoulders than any person I've ever seen, arms hanging down past its knees, and the muscles on it. You could see them even through the hair. This wasn't some guy in a suit. This was something else. "What did you do?" I whispered. "Nothing." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Dad shook his head. It was sniffing the air, moving its head back and forth. I thought for sure it would smell me, but then it just walked away, took these massive strides through the underbrush, barely making a sound. That's what I can't get over, how quiet it was. Something that size should crash through the woods, but it moved like it belonged there more than I did. Did it see you? No. And I thank God for that every day. I don't know what it would have done if it had. Dad took a deep breath. I stayed frozen for maybe 5 minutes after it disappeared. Then I backtracked as carefully as I could, found Bobby, and we got the hell out of there. And Uncle Bobby saw it too. Yeah, about an hour before I did, in a different spot. Glimpsed it moving through the trees. He thought he was seeing things until I described exactly what he'd seen. Dad fixed me with a serious look. "Now listen. People around here, they laugh at these stories, call them campfire tales. But there are others who've seen things in those woods. The Carlsons over on Route 7. Old Jim Hewitt, even Pastor Denny, though he'll never admit it publicly. Something's out there, and it's been there a long time." That was the most Dad ever said about it to me, at least until many years later. He never told Mom, never told his friends. Outside of Uncle Bobby and me, I don't think he ever told another soul. But that experience changed him. He still went hunting, but never again in that area near the small lake. And he was different in subtle ways, more watchful in the woods, more respectful of the wilderness somehow. Like he'd been reminded that humans aren't always at the top of the food chain. As I got older, I started hearing other stories from people around Moose Lake. A couple who were camping and heard bipedal footsteps circling their tent all night. A teenager who was jet skiing and saw something massive watching him from the shoreline. A fisherman who found footprints along a muddy bank that were 18 inches long. One story in particular stuck with me. A family was swimming at the public beach on Moose Lake in the summer of '87. The parents were setting up a picnic while their kids played in the shallows. The father happened to look toward the tree line and saw something watching them, something large and dark that stood upright. When he pointed it out to his wife, it disappeared into the forest. They packed up and left immediately. That was the same beach where I used to swim with my friends. After hearing that, I never went in the water there again. I've lived in this area my whole life, and I've never seen anything myself. But I believe my dad. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy or tall tales. He was practical, logical, and honest to a fault. Uncle Bobby moved to Arizona about 10 years after their encounter. I called him after Dad's funeral last spring, and we talked for a long time. Eventually, the conversation turned to that day in '83. "I still think about it all the time," Bobby told me. "Never saw another one, but I know it was real." "Why do you think Dad never wanted to talk about it?" I asked. "Your dad was a proud man. Being afraid wasn't something he was comfortable with, and that thing, it scared him down to his bones. Made him feel small, you know, like we're not as in control as we think we are." That conversation prompted me to start asking around more actively, collecting accounts from others in the area who'd had similar experiences. I was surprised by how many people were willing to talk once they realized I wasn't going to ridicule them. There's a pattern to the sightings. They almost always happen in the same general area, that remote section of forest near the Canadian border with all those small, unnamed lakes. And they often occur during hunting season, when the woods are filled with people who wouldn't normally be there. Some locals avoid that area entirely now. Others go in groups, never alone. A few dismiss all the stories as nonsense, but I've noticed they tend to be people who don't spend much time in the deep woods. I think about what Dad saw all those years ago, how it affected him for the rest of his life. I think about all the other stories I've heard from people around Moose Lake, and I wonder what's really out there in those northern Minnesota forests, moving quietly between the trees, watching us when we don't know it's there. Whatever it is, it was there long before us, and it'll probably be there long after we're gone. Dad understood that, I think. It's why he never went back to that small lake. Not out of fear exactly, but out of respect for something ancient and powerful that deserves its privacy. I've never returned to that spot either. Some places belong to the wilderness and what lives there. All I have are the stories, Dad's and others, of encounters with something that most people insist can't possibly exist, but I know better, and so did my father. Story 7. I've been debating whether to write this down for a long time. I'm not the type of guy who posts things online, but after 40 years of thinking about what I saw, I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen the same thing. Maybe I'm just going crazy. Either way, I can't keep this bottled up anymore. This happened in November of 1983. I was 25 back then and lived just outside Bemidji in Beltrami County, Minnesota. Growing up in northern Minnesota, hunting was more than just a hobby. It was practically a religion. My dad taught me to hunt when I was 12, and every November since then, I'd been in those woods during deer season. That year was no different. The second week of deer season had just started, and I'd taken a few days off work at the lumber mill to get some hunting in. My cousin Rick was visiting from Duluth, and we'd made plans to hunt an area I knew well, a stretch of mixed forest that bordered a dense cedar swamp about 4 miles from my house. It was Saturday, November 12th. The weather had been unusually warm for November in northern Minnesota, around 40 degrees with patchy clouds. We'd headed out to the hunting spot around 1 in the afternoon. Rick and I split up to cover more ground, as we always did. He went east toward a clearing he'd had luck at the previous year, while I headed to my favorite spot overlooking the cedar swamp. My spot was perfect, a slight ridge that gave me a good vantage point over the lowland swamp area. There was a big pine that had fallen maybe 2 or 3 years back, and I liked to use it as a natural seat. It gave me a clear view for about 100 yards in most directions, and deer often came to feed near the edge of the swamp as dusk approached. I settled in around 2:30, positioning myself on the fallen tree, my Remington 30-06 across my lap. I was dressed in blaze orange, standard for deer season, with layers underneath to stay warm as the temperature would drop when the sun started going down. I had my thermos of coffee, a couple of sandwiches my wife had made, and enough patience to wait out the day. The first few hours were uneventful, typical hunting. I saw a few squirrels, watched an eagle soar overhead, and just enjoyed the peace and quiet. Around 4:30, I ate one of my sandwiches and took a swig of coffee. The shadows were starting to lengthen as the sun began its descent. This was typically when deer would become more active, moving from their bedding areas to feeding spots. At around 5:15, the woods were getting dusky. The light was fading, but there was still enough to see clearly for maybe another 30 or 40 minutes. I was alert, scanning the edges of the swamp methodically, when I first noticed something unusual. About 50 to 75 yards away, down in the cedar swamp, I saw what I initially thought was a bear's head poking up above some of the smaller pine trees. It was black and seemed to be bobbing up and down slightly. I raised my binoculars for a better look. What I saw made me freeze. It wasn't a bear. At least, it didn't look like any bear I'd ever seen in my 20-plus years of hunting these woods. The head was too wrong. It was definitely black, but the shape wasn't right. Bears have a distinctive profile with a longer snout. This head was more rounded, almost human-like, but larger, much larger. I lowered my binoculars, thinking maybe the fading light was playing tricks on me. When I looked again with my naked eye, the head had disappeared. I thought maybe I'd imagined it or it had been a shadow. Then, about 10 seconds later, it reappeared in almost the same spot, but slightly to the left. I quickly raised my binoculars again. There it was, a large black head bobbing above the tree line. It would appear for a few seconds, then duck down, then reappear a few feet away. It was as if, whatever this thing was, it was moving around down there, possibly feeding on something. My heart started pounding harder. I'd seen plenty of wildlife over the years, bears, wolves, moose, you name it, but this was different. The behavior wasn't right for a bear. Bears don't typically move like that, popping up and down in the same general area, and the head just looked off. I kept watching, barely breathing. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, this pattern continued. The black head would appear, stay visible for maybe 5 to 10 seconds, then disappear, only to reappear nearby. It never fully emerged from behind the trees, just the head, and occasionally what might have been shoulders. There was no noise coming from that direction, no breaking branches, no vocalizations, nothing. The woods were completely silent, which was strange in itself. Usually there's background noise, birds, squirrels, wind in the trees. But during those 15 minutes, I realized everything had gone quiet. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs? Maybe, but bears don't typically stay upright for that long. A moose? No. The coloration and shape were all wrong. Some guy in dark clothing. Possible, but who would be wandering around a swamp at dusk during hunting season without blaze orange? As I watched, I became increasingly certain that whatever I was looking at was tall, much taller than a human. Based on my knowledge of the trees in that area, whatever it was had to be standing at least 7 or 8 feet tall to be visible above those particular pines. Then, at one point, the head turned. I swear it turned in my direction, though I couldn't make out facial features clearly through the binoculars in the fading light. Just a dark silhouette that seemed to pause longer than before, as if it was looking straight at me. My blood ran cold. I'm not easily spooked. I've encountered black bears alone in the woods, had wolves circle my camp, and once even had a run-in with an angry moose. But something about this encounter felt fundamentally wrong. There was an intelligence to the movement that unsettled me deeply. I slowly lowered my binoculars, never taking my eyes off the spot where I'd last seen the head. My rifle was still across my lap, and my hand instinctively moved toward it. Not that I intended to shoot. I had no idea what I was looking at, and you don't shoot what you can't identify. But having the cold steel under my palm was somehow reassuring. The head appeared once more, this time lingering longer than before. I raised the binoculars again with shaky hands. The light was getting worse by the minute, but I could swear that this time I saw eyes. Dark, deep-set eyes that didn't reflect light like an animal's would. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, the figure ducked down and didn't come back up. I sat there frozen for what must have been another 20 minutes. The light continued to fade until I could barely see the swamp anymore. Still, I didn't move. Every instinct told me to stay still, to not draw attention to myself. Eventually, when the woods were almost completely dark and I hadn't seen anything for nearly half an hour, I decided it was time to leave. Moving as quietly as possible, I stood up from my fallen tree perch. My legs were stiff from sitting motionless for so long, and my hands were cold despite my gloves. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and began slowly backing away, keeping my eyes fixed on the swamp area. I didn't turn my back on that spot until I was a good 30 yards away, hidden by the denser forest of the upland. Once I felt I was at a safe distance, I picked up my pace, moving as quickly and quietly as I could through the darkening forest toward our predetermined meeting spot. Rick and I had agreed to meet back at my truck around 6:30, regardless of success. Rick was already there when I arrived, leaning against the truck and looking bored. "Any luck?" he asked when he saw me. I just shook my head, not ready to talk about what I'd seen. I must have looked shaken because Rick gave me a concerned look. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just cold. Didn't see any deer." "You?" Rick shook his head. "Nah, nothing. Woods were dead quiet over on my side, not even squirrels moving around." That struck me as odd. The unusual silence had extended to where Rick was hunting, a quarter-mile away, yet he hadn't seen anything unusual. On the drive home, I kept replaying those 15 minutes in my head. What had I seen? Every explanation I come up with, bear, moose, trespasser, had holes in it. None fully explained the height, the movement pattern, the complete silence. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that black head turning toward me, those eyes seeming to look directly at me. I told myself it was just a bear, that the fading light and my isolation had made my imagination run wild, but I didn't believe it. The next morning, I made an excuse not to go hunting. I told Rick I wasn't feeling well, possibly coming down with something. He went alone to a different spot miles away from the cedar swamp. I couldn't bring myself to go back there. In the days that followed, I debated whether to tell anyone what I'd seen. In the end, I decided against it. Northern Minnesota is full of hunters and outdoorsmen who would have laughed off my story as the product of buck fever or too many hours alone in the woods. My wife noticed something was off, but I told her I was just disappointed about not getting a deer. Over the years, I've researched similar sightings in northern Minnesota. I've read about Bigfoot encounters, learned about Wendigo legends from the local Ojibwe, and even looked into reports of upright walking bears. None quite matched what I saw, yet all seemed somehow connected. I've never gone back to that specific hunting spot. There are plenty of other places to hunt in Beltrami County, and I've told myself it's because the deer patterns changed, or the fallen tree I used to sit on has probably rotted away. But the truth is, I'm afraid of what I might see if I went back. To this day, I still don't know what I saw in those woods. Was it some undiscovered creature? A Sasquatch, as some would call it? Or was it just a bear behaving strangely in the fading light? I can't say for certain. What I do know is that for 15 minutes in November of 1983, I watched something move through that cedar swamp that defied explanation. Something tall, dark, and deliberate that seemed aware of my presence. Something that, despite my decades of experience in those woods, made me feel like I was the one being hunted. I've never told this story before now. It's been 40 years of questioning my own senses, 40 years of wondering if I should have investigated further or if I made the right choice by leaving. 40 years of occasionally waking up in a cold sweat, remembering those eyes that seemed to look right through me. If you've seen something similar in the northern woods of Minnesota or anywhere else, I'd like to know I'm not alone. And if you hunt near cedar swamps in Beltrami County, maybe think twice about staying out until dusk. There are things in those woods that don't appear in any hunting guide, things that might be watching you even as you think you're alone. Story 8. I've kept this story to myself for decades now, only sharing it with close family and a handful of trusted friends. Even now, typing this out makes my hands shake a bit. What happened that day in October 1985 still haunts me, and I'm finally ready to put it out there. My buddy Craig and I had been planning this hunting trip for weeks. We were after grouse near Bean and Bear Lakes outside Silver Bay, Minnesota. It's beautiful country up there in Lake County, especially in the fall when the leaves are changing. I'd grown up hunting those woods, knew them like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. We headed out before dawn that morning, the kind of crisp October day that makes you glad to be alive. The temperature was perfect, cold enough for a jacket, but not so cold that your fingers go numb on the trigger. By mid-morning, we'd already bagged 3 grouse and were feeling pretty good about ourselves. Around 2 p.m., we found ourselves in this little clearing absolutely loaded with berries, blueberries, raspberries, the works. A perfect feeding ground for grouse. We'd been there maybe 20 minutes when we heard it. The sound is something I'll never forget. A howl that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard in those woods before. And I've heard plenty of wolves, coyotes, you name it. This was different. Lower, more guttural, almost like it had 2 tones layered on top of each other. And loud. Jesus, it was loud. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up immediately. Without even looking at each other, Craig and I both dropped to the ground and started reloading our shotguns with slugs instead of birdshot. We'd brought them just in case we ran into a bear, which wasn't uncommon up there. Not a word was exchanged between us. We didn't need to talk. 20+ years of friendship and hunting together, we just knew. I remember looking at Craig's face and seeing my own fear reflected back at me. His eyes were wide, scanning the tree line. His hands were steady, though. Craig was always steady when it counted. "What the hell was that?" he finally whispered. I shook my head. "No idea. Not a wolf. Not a bear either," he added. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, listening. Nothing. The woods had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the forest knows that silence is never a good sign. The sun was starting to get low in the sky. We were probably about 3 miles from where we'd parked the car, and I was beginning to think about heading back. In those northern woods, darkness falls fast in October, and neither of us was equipped for night hiking. "We should start heading back," I said quietly. Craig nodded, and we gathered our stuff. The problem was, to get back to the car, we'd need to go through a particularly nasty, swampy area with some of the densest undergrowth I'd ever encountered. And I've hunted in places all over the world. This wasn't just thick brush. It was like nature had decided to build a fortress of alder thickets, fallen trees, and waist-deep mud pits. We'd barely started moving when we heard it again, that same howl, but this time it was closer, maybe 200 yards away, and it was directly between us and the car. "Shit," Craig muttered. We froze, listening intently. That's when we heard movement, something big crashing through the underbrush. Not constantly, but in spurts, like it was moving, then stopping to listen, then moving again. Now, I've encountered plenty of wildlife in my day. I know what a moose sounds like when it's bulldozing through the forest. I know the distinctive sound of a black bear shuffling around. This wasn't either of those. The movements were too deliberate, too intelligent. Craig and I exchanged glances. Without a word, we dropped the 3 grouse we'd shot. They suddenly didn't seem important anymore. "You think we can circle around?" Craig whispered. I shook my head. Too swampy on either side. We'd never make it out before dark. So we decided to continue on our planned route, but much more cautiously. Each step was careful, deliberate. We moved as quietly as 2 grown men can move through dense undergrowth, which isn't very quiet at all. The shadows were getting longer by the minute. It was probably around 5:30 p.m., and we had maybe an hour of decent light left. That's when things got truly terrifying. We heard movement off to our right, parallel to the trail we were on. Something was flanking us, and it was moving fast. Faster than any bull moose I'd ever encountered, and that's saying something. It was keeping pace with us, despite the dense brush, which should have been nearly impossible for an animal that size. "It's following us," Craig whispered, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. We picked up our pace, no longer worried about making noise. Whatever was tracking us already knew exactly where we were. For a few hundred yards, this nightmarish game of cat and mouse continued. The creature would crash through the brush, stop, then crash again, always maintaining that same distance, always on our right flank. It was herding us, I realized with a chill, guiding our movement. That's not animal behavior, that's strategy. Then we came to an old clearing from a logging operation that had been there maybe 20 years earlier. The sun was just at that perfect angle where the clearing was illuminated, but the woods around it were already dark with shadow. That's when we saw it. Against the fading light, we could see its complete outline as it moved along the edge of the clearing. It was massive, walking upright on two legs, at least 7 feet tall, probably more. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, with long arms that seemed to hang lower than a human's would. In the dim light, I couldn't make out its color exactly, dark brown or maybe black, but what struck me most was how it moved, fluid, purposeful, nothing like the awkward lumbering of a bear on its hind legs. Craig grabbed my arm so hard I had a bruise the next day. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, frozen, watching this thing watch us. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, it melted back into the forest with barely a sound. The silence that followed was almost worse than seeing it. "Did you?" Craig started. "Yeah," I cut him off. "I saw it." We continued on, practically jogging now despite the difficult terrain, our shotguns ready. Every few minutes, we'd hear it moving through the brush, still keeping pace, still following. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mouth was bone dry. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I knew that would be the worst thing to do. As we crossed over a ridge, the sounds began to fade. We were getting closer to a more frequently used trail that connected to the forestry road where our car was parked. The creature seemed reluctant to follow us into an area where it might encounter other humans. By the time we reached the car, it was almost completely dark. I've never been so happy to see a beat-up old Ford in my life. We threw our gear in the back and jumped in, not even bothering to case our shotguns properly. I started the engine and cranked the heat, not because it was particularly cold, but because we were both shaking so badly. Neither of us said much on the drive back to Silver Bay. What was there to say? We'd both seen something that shouldn't exist, something that our rational minds couldn't process. The next morning, over breakfast at the local diner, we finally talked about it. "What do you think it was?" Craig asked, his voice low even though nobody was sitting near us. I shook my head. "I don't know, not a bear, not a moose, not anything I've ever seen before." "Bigfoot?" He said it half jokingly, but his eyes were serious. I didn't laugh. "Maybe. I don't know what else it could have been." We debated whether to tell anyone. In the end, we decided against it. Who would believe us? Two grown men claiming they were stalked through the woods by some kind of giant, upright creature? We'd be laughingstocks, so we kept it to ourselves. Craig moved to Oregon a few years later, and I ended up in Washington State. We still talk occasionally, and whenever we do, the conversation eventually circles back to that day in October. Neither of us has ever changed our story or questioned what we saw. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it over the years. I'm college-educated, rational, not prone to flights of fancy. I've been an outdoorsman all my life. I know what's supposed to be in those woods and what isn't, but there's something else I know too. Northern Minnesota is vast. There are places up there where humans rarely, if ever, set foot. Thousands of square miles of wilderness. Could there be a population of these creatures living there, largely undetected? I think so. Maybe dozens, maybe hundreds. I've read accounts from other people who've had similar experiences, and so many details match up with what Craig and I encountered. The howling, the way it moved, the feeling of being watched or stalked. I'm no longer skeptical when I hear these stories. I've never gone back to that specific area to hunt again. Not because I'm afraid, although maybe that's part of it. It's more that I feel like I was given a glimpse of something most people will never see, and pushing my luck seems disrespectful somehow. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself reliving those moments. The howl that didn't belong, the crashing through the brush keeping pace with us, that silhouette against the twilight sky. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, if someone told me this story, I'm not sure I'd believe them either. But Craig and I know what we saw that day. Something was out there in those woods. Something intelligent. Something that wanted us to know it was there. And sometimes that's what scares me the most. Not that it might have attacked us, but that it chose not to. That it was curious, watching, learning. That it was studying us just as much as we were trying to understand it. I still go hunting, still spend time in the backcountry, but I never go anywhere without a sidearm now, and I'm always back at the car well before dark. And whenever I'm in the woods, and that unnatural silence falls, when the birds stop singing and the small creatures go still, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive silhouette watching me from between the trees. Whatever it was that followed us through those swampy woods that October evening, I'm convinced it's still out there. And sometimes on windy nights when the trees creak and groan outside my window, I swear I can hear that distinctive dual-toned howl echoing across the decades. Story 9. I still get chills thinking about that trip, and I've never been able to explain what happened, even all these years later. I don't talk about it much. Most people just think you're crazy or making stuff up for attention. But this was real, and it changed how I feel about being in the woods forever. It was May of 1986, and 4 of us from Duluth Air Force Base decided to take a long weekend for a canoe trip in northern Minnesota. Me, Roy, Dave, and Mark had been planning this for months. We were all stationed together and had become pretty good friends over the 2 years I'd been there. Roy was the outdoorsy type who'd grown up hunting and fishing in Wisconsin. Dave was from Texas and had never been on a real wilderness trip before. Mark was our quiet guy, an engineer type who planned everything meticulously. We had permits for Lake Agnes, which is pretty deep in the Superior National Forest in St. Louis County. It took us most of the morning to get there from Duluth, and we were pumped to finally hit the water around noon. The weather was perfect, about 65 degrees, sunny, with just a light breeze. We had 2 canoes loaded with gear, food for 4 days, and a couple 6-packs, which we probably weren't supposed to have, but hey, we were young Air Force guys on our time off. We paddled across Lake Agnes to a nice campsite on the northwestern shore. It had a great view of the lake, a fire ring, and enough flat ground for our 2 tents. We were just setting up when a Forest Service ranger paddled over to our site. He seemed apologetic, but told us they were asking everyone to relocate from Lake Agnes due to increased bear activity. Apparently, a mother black bear with cubs had been spotted near several campsites, and they'd already had one incident where campers had food stolen. The ranger suggested we move to Ram's Head Lake, about 2.5 miles southwest. He said it was less crowded and had some nice island sites that bears rarely swim to. Roy was a little annoyed at having to pack everything back up, but the ranger marked the portage routes on our map and we headed out. It took us a couple hours to get to Ram's Head, including 2 portages where we had to carry the canoes and all our gear overland. By the time we reached the new lake, it was late afternoon. The ranger had been right about one thing. We had the whole lake to ourselves. We chose a small island campsite near the eastern shore. It wasn't much bigger than a basketball court, with a rocky beach on one side where we could pull up our canoes. We set up camp again and cooked some freeze-dried lasagna for dinner. After we ate, everyone was pretty tired from the day's paddling and portaging. Dave and Mark decided to fish from shore for a bit, and Roy said he was going to take a nap. I was still feeling restless, so I decided to take one of the canoes and explore a bit. I remembered seeing on the map that Meander Creek fed into Ram's Head Lake from the north, and there was supposed to be a small waterfall somewhere upstream. It was only about 5:30, so I figured I had plenty of daylight left to check it out and be back well before dark. I told the guys where I was going, grabbed a water bottle and my compass, and paddled off. It took me about 20 minutes to reach the creek mouth on the northern shore. I beached the canoe on a muddy bank and started hiking upstream along the creek. The woods were pretty thick with birch and pine trees, but there was enough of a game trail alongside the creek that I could follow it easily. I hiked maybe half a mile before I found the waterfall, which turned out to be more of a cascade, maybe 5 feet high at most. Still, it was a pretty spot with moss-covered rocks and clear water. I sat down on a boulder next to the creek to take a break and have some water. That's when everything changed. At first, it was just a sound, rustling in the underbrush maybe 30 yards behind me. I didn't think much of it initially. The woods are full of animals, and I figured it was probably a deer or maybe even a moose. But then I realized whatever it was seemed to be moving in a half circle around me, staying just out of sight in the thicker brush. I stood up and called out, "Hello?" thinking maybe it was another hiker, though that seemed unlikely given how remote we were. No answer. The movement stopped for a minute, and I started to feel uneasy. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl, the distinct sound of something hitting a tree with what sounded like a log or a heavy branch. Crack! It was loud and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. My heart started racing. I turned toward the sound, which seemed to come from about 50 yards away, up the slope from the creek. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but I had the overwhelming feeling of being watched. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer, but the footfalls started again, moving upstream away from me. Then another crack. This one sounded different, like it was now about 100 yards upstream. I don't know how to explain what I felt in that moment. It wasn't just fear, it was this primal sensation of being hunted or stalked. Whatever was making those sounds was big, it was moving deliberately, and it seemed to be trying to communicate something. I didn't wait around to find out what. I grabbed my water bottle and hustled back down the trail toward my canoe. I wasn't running. I was too afraid of tripping on the uneven ground, but I was moving as fast as I safely could. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something coming after me. I reached my canoe, pushed off from the bank and paddled hard back toward our campsite. The whole time I was on the water, I kept looking back at the shoreline, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. When I pulled up to our island, Roy was sitting by the fire pit. He looked up, surprised. "That was quick," he said. "Thought you'd be gone until sunset." I must have looked pretty shaken because his expression changed to concern. "What happened? You looked like you saw a ghost." I caught my breath and told him what I'd heard. Dave and Mark came over from where they'd been fishing, and I repeated the story. Roy seemed fascinated rather than scared. "Wood knocking," he said thoughtfully. "That's interesting." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I've read about that. Some people think it's how Bigfoot communicates. They bang sticks against trees." Dave laughed. "Bigfoot? Come on, man." But Roy wasn't laughing. "Look, I'm not saying that's what it was, but something was out there making those sounds, right?" I nodded. "So let's go check it out," Roy said. "There's 4 of us. It's still light out. If it's just some other campers messing around, we should know about it." I wasn't thrilled about going back, but I also didn't want to look like a coward. Plus, the idea of safety in numbers made me feel a little better. We left Mark at the campsite to keep an eye on our gear, and the 3 of us took the canoes back to where I'd been. We beached the canoes, and I led Roy and Dave up the same trail I'd followed earlier. We were all quiet, listening carefully. When we reached the small waterfall, I pointed to the boulder where I'd been sitting. "I was right here when I heard the first sounds from back there," I said, gesturing to the thicker woods behind us. We stood there for a few minutes, just listening to the creak and the occasional bird call. Nothing unusual. I was starting to feel a bit foolish for being so scared earlier. Then we heard it. Crack! The sound of wood hitting wood, but this time it was much closer, maybe only 15 yards away in the heavy brush to our right. Dave jumped. What the hell was that? Roy didn't say anything. He just grabbed his canoe paddle, which he'd brought along, and started pushing through the underbrush toward the sound. Roy, wait! I called after him, but he was already forcing his way through the thick bushes. Dave and I looked at each other, unsure what to do. Then we heard another crack. This one further away, in the direction Roy had gone. A minute later, we heard Roy call out, "Guys, I think I need some help finding my way back." His voice sounded tense, maybe even scared. Dave and I crashed through the brush toward his voice. We found him about 30 yards in, looking disoriented. "You okay?" I asked. Roy shook his head. It kept making that sound, always just ahead of me, like it was leading me deeper in. Then I realized I couldn't see the creek anymore, and I got turned around. He paused. "I think something was trying to lure me away from you guys." That was enough for all of us. We quickly made our way back to the creek, following it downstream to our canoes. No one spoke much on the paddle back to camp. When we told Mark what had happened, he looked skeptical but didn't say much. We built up the fire bigger than we needed to that night. No one wanted to admit it, but I think we were all spooked. We talked about what it could have been, another hiker playing tricks, a bear, maybe even some kind of bird that mimics sounds, but none of the explanations felt right. We turned in around 11, Dave and Mark in one tent, Roy and I in the other. I had trouble falling asleep, listening to every little sound outside the tent. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak and the water lap against the rocky shore of our island. It must have been around 4 in the morning when I was jolted awake by a loud splash. Not like a fish jumping. This was big, like someone had thrown a boulder into the lake. It came from the direction of the mainland shore, maybe 100 yards from our island. Roy was already sitting up. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. We listened for more sounds, but there was nothing except the wind and waves. After about half an hour, I managed to fall back into an uneasy sleep. At first light, around 5:30, Roy woke me up. "Come look at this," he said, his voice tense. I followed him down to the rocky beach where we'd left our canoes. The others were already there, staring at something on one of the large, flat rocks right at the water's edge. It was a footprint, a single, very large, very clear footprint in a patch of mud on the rock. It was pressed deep, like whatever made it was heavy. And it was big, at least 14 inches long, proportionally wide, with what looked like 5 toes at the front. It was unmistakably foot-shaped, but not human. No human has a foot that size. "That wasn't there last night," Mark said quietly. We all knew what that meant. Whatever made that footprint had to have swum across about 100 yards of lake water to reach our island. In the dark, in May, in Minnesota, when the lake water is still frigid from winter. Dave broke the silence. "We're leaving, now." No one argued. We packed up camp in record time, barely speaking as we stuffed sleeping bags and collapsed tents. Within 30 minutes, we had the canoes loaded and were paddling hard for the main shore, then following the portage trail back toward where we'd left the car. It was a grueling journey out, especially since we were rushing and exhausted from lack of sleep. But fear is a powerful motivator. We made it back to the car by early afternoon and drove straight back to Duluth without stopping. The strange thing is, during the whole experience, we never smelled anything unusual or heard any growling or grunting or screaming, things people often report with Bigfoot encounters. Just those deliberate wood knocks, the splashing, and that massive footprint. Years later, in 1997, I was volunteering on an Indian reserve near Ontario, and I heard some of the local stories about the Wendigo and missing canoes. They had these tales about canoes disappearing overnight from lake shores. The interesting thing was, most people said they couldn't be explained by theft because navigating the pitch-black rocky trails at night without being detected would be nearly impossible. One day, an old outfitter who'd been guiding trips in the Boundary Waters for 30 years pulled me aside after overhearing me mention our Rams Head Lake experience to someone else. He told me about taking a Boy Scout troop through Lady Boot Lake once and hearing similar wood-knocking sounds and low grunts that terrified the kids. He said he'd never been back to that part of the Boundary Waters and never wanted to repeat the experience. I still go camping and hiking, but never alone and never in that part of Minnesota again. Sometimes when I'm in the woods and hear a branch snap, I freeze up, waiting for that deliberate crack sound to follow. So far, it hasn't. I hope it never does. I don't know what was out there on Rams Head Lake in '86. I can't explain that footprint or the wood knocking or why something would try to lure Roy deeper into the woods away from us. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it was interested in us in a way I never want to experience again. Story 10. I've never actually written this out before. I've told a few people over the years, but most just give me that look. You know the one. So, I guess it feels better getting this off my chest to people who won't immediately think I'm crazy or making stuff up for attention. This happened back in '86, when I was 18. I grew up in central Pennsylvania on this big 40-acre property, mostly woods. My dad bought the land when I was just a kid, and I basically spent my whole childhood there. Our house sat in a clearing near the front of the property, but the rest was all forest, oak, maple, pine, the works. Growing up there, I learned every trail and hollow like the back of my hand. I was always out there hunting, hiking, or helping my dad cut firewood. The woods were basically my second home. It was late October, probably the 25th or so. The leaves had mostly fallen, and there was that crisp autumn smell in the air. The kind of day that's perfect for hiking, cool but not cold, clear skies. I decided to go check out this seasonal creek bed about 2 miles from our house. It usually dried up by late summer, but with the fall rains, I figured it might have some interesting things washed up. Plus, it was in a part of the woods I didn't visit all that often. I remember wearing my old denim jacket, jeans, and these work boots I'd had forever. I took a small backpack with water, a sandwich, and a few other things. No gun that day. Wasn't hunting, just exploring. I did have my pocket knife, though. Always carried that. It took me about 45 minutes to reach the creek bed. I was taking my time, enjoying the hike. The forest was pretty quiet that day. Not many birds around, which I didn't think much about at the time. But looking back, it was strange. There should have been crows, woodpeckers, jays, something. I had been following the creek bed for maybe 15 or 20 minutes when I first noticed the smell. That's what I remember most vividly, even after all these years. It was this overwhelming, disgusting odor, like a mix of wet garbage that had been sitting in the sun for days, rotten meat, and the worst, strongest body odor you could imagine. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I actually covered my nose with my jacket sleeve. My first thought was, maybe there was a dead deer nearby. But this was different. I'd smelled plenty of carcasses before. This was something else entirely. It was almost, I don't know, musky, like an animal's smell, but nothing I'd encountered before. I stood there for a minute, debating whether to keep going or head back. The smell was making me feel sick, but I was curious about where it was coming from. That's when I noticed something moving on the ridge about 50 yards away to my right. At first, it was just a shape shifting behind some trees. I figured it was a deer or maybe a black bear. We had plenty of both in the area. I stayed still, squinting to get a better look. Then it stepped out from behind a big oak, and I swear my heart stopped. This thing was walking upright on 2 legs. But it wasn't a person, not even close. It was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be at least 7 or 8 feet. And the width of it, the shoulders were incredibly broad, probably twice as wide as mine. The whole body was covered in hair, this light grayish color that reminded me of weathered stone. The hair seemed thinner around the shoulders and chest area, almost patchy. It had these incredibly long arms that hung down past its knees. Its legs were proportionally long too, but thick, powerful looking. I couldn't see its face clearly from my angle and distance, but I could see the profile. It had this pointed head that sloped back, no forehead like a human. The head sat forward on the shoulders, and there was no neck that I could see. It was just wrong. Everything about its proportions was just wrong compared to a human. The way it moved was what really got to me. This thing was huge, but it moved silently, absolutely no sound. Not a snapped twig or rustled leaf. It was walking deliberately with purpose, like it was heading somewhere specific. Its arms swung slightly as it walked, but otherwise, its movements were surprisingly fluid for something so large. I stood completely frozen. I don't think I even breathed. My mind kept flipping between this can't be real and holy shit, this is really happening. I remember feeling this weird disconnection, like I was watching a movie of myself standing there. The creature never looked directly at me, at least I don't think it did. It just kept walking along the ridge, and then it moved behind another cluster of trees and disappeared from view. I waited for it to emerge on the other side, but it never did. I stayed rooted to that spot for what felt like forever, probably 10 or 15 minutes in reality. I was terrified that if I moved, it might notice me, or worse, that there might be others I couldn't see. The smell was still heavy in the air, which told me it was probably still nearby. When I finally decided to leave, I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on where I'd seen the creature. Once I was about 100 yards away, I turned and walked quickly back the way I'd come. I didn't run. Something told me running would be a bad idea, but I moved as fast as I could while still staying quiet. The entire way home, I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for anything following me. Every snapping twig made me jump. The woods that had always been my sanctuary suddenly felt threatening, alien. When I got home, I was shaking. My mom asked if I was sick, said I looked pale as a ghost. I didn't tell my parents what happened. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. What would I even say? Hey, I think I saw Bigfoot. I'd grown up reading about Bigfoot in those cheesy tabloids at the grocery checkout, but I'd never actually believed they existed. It was just a fun thing to imagine, like UFOs or the Loch Ness Monster. But what I saw that day wasn't some guy in a costume. The movements were too natural, too fluid, and that smell, you can't fake a smell like that. And why would anyone be out there anyway? Our property was private, miles from any main road, and I was deep in the woods. For the next few weeks, I barely slept. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to convince myself it was a bear or some other animal, but I knew what I'd seen. I'd been hunting since I was 12. I knew what bears looked like, how they moved. This was something else entirely. I avoided that specific area for months, but eventually, my curiosity started to outweigh my fear. I began exploring the woods again, though I never went alone anymore, and I always took my dad's rifle. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before, places where small trees had been broken, not cut or gnawed by beavers, just snapped clean off about 5 or 6 feet up. Strange arrangements of sticks that didn't look natural, and twice, after heavy rains, I found what looked like footprints in muddy areas, massive prints, easily 15 inches long, with 5 toes. About 8 months after the encounter, in the summer of '87, I was camping with a buddy about a mile from our house. My friend had fallen asleep, but I was still awake, staring at the campfire. Around midnight, I heard this sound echoing through the valley, a loud whooping noise rising in pitch, unlike any animal I'd ever heard. It wasn't a coyote or an owl or anything I could identify. My friend slept through it, but I was wide awake, heart pounding. The sound came 3 times, each about 5 minutes apart, then silence. I woke my friend up, told him I wasn't feeling well, and we packed up and went back to my house. I never told him the real reason. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion, a bear standing on its hind legs in just the right light. Maybe I was more tired than I realized that day and my mind played tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I've never seen another one since that day, though I've spent thousands of hours in the woods. I moved to Idaho about 15 years ago, live near the Sawtooth Mountains now. Still spend most of my free time outdoors, still hunt and hike, but I approach the wilderness differently. I'm more aware, more respectful maybe. I make more noise when I'm hiking alone, let anything out there know I'm coming. Sometimes, when I'm deep in the backcountry, I get that feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I know it's time to move on. I've smelled that same distinctive odor a couple of times over the years, just faintly on the wind, and I always turn around when I do. That day changed me. It showed me that there are things out there we don't understand, things that have managed to stay hidden despite all our technology and developments. I think about how that creature moved, so silent, so deliberate. They've probably been watching us for centuries, learning how to avoid us. A couple of years ago, I stumbled across some online forums where people share similar experiences. It was weirdly comforting to know I wasn't alone. Some of the stories described exactly what I saw: the gray hair, the proportions, the silent movement, that unmistakable smell. I still don't talk about it much. My wife knows and a couple of close friends. Most people don't want to hear it, or they think you're making it up for attention. But I know what I saw. And I know it was real. That thing in the woods was intelligent, I'm sure of it. It moved with purpose. It probably knew I was there the whole time and chose to let me see it. Maybe it was curious about me. Or maybe it was sending a message. This is my territory, remember that. Every October, when the leaves start to fall and that crisp autumn smell fills the air, I think about that day. I wonder if it's still out there in those Pennsylvania woods, or if there are others like it here in Idaho. I wonder if someday researchers will find definitive proof, or if these creatures will just continue to stay one step ahead of us, glimpsed only by the occasional hiker who happens to be in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on how you look at it. I'm 56 now. I've had a good life, raised 2 kids, built a successful plumbing business. But that single encounter when I was 18 remains one of the most vivid, life-changing moments I've ever experienced. It taught me that the world is bigger and stranger than we think, that there are mysteries out there that might never be solved, and honestly, maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some things are meant to remain undiscovered, living their lives parallel to ours, occasionally crossing paths, but mostly keeping to themselves. All I know is I saw something that day that wasn't supposed to exist. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget it. The size, the movement, that awful smell. And sometimes when I'm alone in the woods and the wind dies down and everything gets quiet, I find myself holding my breath, listening, just listening. Story 11. I still get chills thinking about what happened 5 years ago in the Ankwa National Forest. My sister Sarah and I had made these camping trips our yearly tradition since we were in our 20s, but after summer 2017, I'm not sure we'll ever go back to that particular spot again. We're experienced campers, and we specifically seek out dispersed camping areas to avoid the crowds and noise of established campgrounds. That July, we found what seemed like the perfect spot about 4 miles off the main forest road in Oregon. It required a 1/4-mile hike from an old logging trail, which was perfect, just remote enough to keep the RV crowd and loud weekend warriors away, but not so far that we couldn't haul our gear. The spot was gorgeous, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and firs, with a little brook bubbling nearby that provided the perfect white noise for sleeping. We set up our two-person tent and created our little camp kitchen area with our portable stove, cooler and supplies all neatly organized. We'd done this so many times it was second nature. The first day and night were completely normal. We hiked, gathered firewood, cooked dinner, and enjoyed the typical chorus of forest sounds: coyotes yipping in the distance, frogs croaking by the brook, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the constant chirping of crickets once night fell. We sat by our small fire until it died down, then crawled into our tent around 11, exhausted but happy. It was exactly the peaceful escape from civilization we'd been craving. The second day, we had planned to do a longer hike to a lookout point a few miles away, but Sarah's knee was acting up, an old injury from college soccer that flares up sometimes. So we decided to stay closer to camp, just doing a short walk along the brook in the morning and then spending the afternoon reading and relaxing at our site. That's when I first noticed something was off. It was mid-afternoon, maybe around 3 or 4, and I suddenly realized I couldn't hear anything. No birds, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing, nothing. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the forest. I mentioned it to Sarah, but we both just assumed it was one of those weird, quiet moments that happen sometimes. Maybe a hawk or other predator was nearby. The silence eventually passed, and by evening, things seemed normal again. We made a simple dinner of canned soup, heated on our small stove, cleaned up thoroughly, always important in bear country, and hung our food bag from a branch about 100 feet from our tent. We didn't bother with a fire that night since it wasn't particularly cold, and we were both pretty tired despite not doing much hiking. We brushed our teeth at the brook, used our little portable toilet set up a short distance from camp, and got into our sleeping bags around 9:30. I remember checking the time on my watch and thinking how early it was to be going to bed, but there's something about being outdoors that just makes you sync up with the sun. Sarah fell asleep almost immediately. I could tell by her breathing, but I was having trouble drifting off despite being tired. I lay there listening to the normal nighttime forest sounds, trying to empty my mind. It must have been around 10:30 when I first heard it. A slow, deliberate footstep, then another, then another. My first thought was that it was a deer, but the rhythm was all wrong. Deer move with a distinctive 4-beat pattern. These steps were clearly bipedal, 2-legged, and they were heavy, making the forest floor crunch slightly with each step. I froze. My heart started hammering so hard I was sure it would wake Sarah. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears to track the sound. The footsteps were moving slowly, methodically in a circle around our campsite. This wasn't someone wandering lost in the dark. This was purposeful movement. I reached over and gently shook Sarah. She stirred, and I whispered as quietly as I possibly could, "Don't make any noise, there's something outside." I felt her body tense up next to me as she became fully aware. The steps continued their circuit of our camp. Whatever it was taking its time, moving with careful precision. There was no sound of equipment jingling, no flashlight beam visible through the tent walls, none of the normal human noises you'd expect from a hiker. No coughing, no talking to themselves, nothing but those slow, deliberate footsteps. Then they started getting closer to our tent. I've never been so terrified in my life. Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness of the tent, and we clutched each other, barely breathing. The steps came closer, closer, until whatever it was stood no more than 10 feet from our tent. I could hear distinct sniffing sounds, like it was smelling the air, trying to catch our scent. My mind was racing through possibilities. A bear wouldn't move like that. A mountain lion would be silent. A human would have a light, would call out, would make normal human sounds. This was something else entirely, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. We lay there, absolutely still, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, slowly, the footsteps began to recede, moving back toward the tree line. We heard branches softly brush against something large, and then silence, but we knew it wasn't gone. Every few minutes throughout the night, we'd hear those footsteps again, circling at a distance, sometimes coming closer, sometimes moving away. It was like whatever it was out there was studying us, watching our tent, trying to figure us out. Sarah whispered, "Should we make a run for it?" But I squeezed her hand in response. Running through unfamiliar forest in the pitch black with something out there was suicide. We were safer staying put, as terrifying as that was. We didn't sleep a wink. We just lay there listening to those periodic circuits of our campsite, our eyes wide open, although there was nothing to see in the darkness of our tent. I kept waiting for it to make some aggressive move, to approach our tent, to do something threatening, but it never did. It just kept up that methodical observation. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, I noticed that the normal forest sounds started to return. First it was just a few crickets, then more joined in. A distant owl hooted. The brook's burbling seemed to grow louder again, though I knew that was just my perception changing. Whatever had been out there had moved on, or at least moved far enough away that the forest no longer felt its presence. We waited until the first light of dawn before we dared to unzip the tent. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the zipper. The morning forest looked completely normal, peaceful even, with mist rising from the ground and birds starting their morning songs. But both of us felt a lingering sense of being watched. Once it was fully light, we cautiously emerged and began to inspect the area around our campsite. The ground was dry and hard-packed, not the kind that would show clear footprints. But there was evidence something had been there. The pine needles and leaf litter had been displaced in a clear path that circled our tent and campsite, exactly matching the pattern of footsteps we'd heard. In a few places, we found broken twigs and disturbed moss. But the most unsettling thing was our food bag. We'd hung it properly, at least 15 feet high and 6 feet from the trunk of the tree. It was undisturbed, but there were scratch marks on the tree trunk about 8 feet up, as if something tall had reached up and tried to get at it. Sarah and I barely spoke as we examined the evidence. Finally, she said, "Emma, what do you think it was?" I didn't have an answer. Part of me didn't want to have an answer. Because here's the thing, whatever visited our camp that night didn't seem threatening. Terrifying, yes, but not aggressive. It seemed curious, methodical, intelligent. It was studying us, not hunting us. And that, in some ways, was even more unsettling. We both agreed that there was no way it could have been a regular person. No ordinary human would navigate the pitch-black forest 4 miles from any road without a light. No human would move with that deliberate, almost primal care, making almost no sound despite their size. And no human would spend hours circling a campsite, sniffing the air, without ever making a sound or revealing themselves. As we packed up our gear, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a forest ranger checking on campers, but they would announce themselves, use a flashlight, make normal human sounds. A poacher? Again, they'd need light to see, and typically want to avoid campers, not study them for hours. The only explanation that made any sense was one neither of us wanted to say out loud. The Pacific Northwest has its legends. Most people laugh them off. We used to be among them. We had planned to stay one more night, but by unspoken mutual agreement, we packed everything up and hiked back to our car. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched from the trees. Every rustling leaf, every snapped twig made us jump and scan the forest around us. When we reached our car, we threw our gear in and sat there for a minute, finally letting ourselves breathe. Sarah looked at me and said, "I don't think we should tell people about this." I nodded in agreement. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. But it's been 5 years and I still can't explain what happened that night. I've done research since then, read accounts from others who've had similar experiences in the forests of Oregon, Washington, Northern California. There are enough similarities to make my skin crawl. The deliberate footsteps, the curious observation, the intelligence behind the behavior. I don't know for sure what circled our tent that night in the Anqua National Forest, but I do know this. There's something out there in those woods that doesn't fit into our ordinary understanding of the world. Something that walks on 2 legs, but isn't human. Something intelligent enough to be curious about us, but wild enough to keep its distance. Sarah and I still go camping, but we stick to established campgrounds now with other people around. And sometimes, when I'm lying in my tent at night listening to the normal sounds of other campers settling in, I remember those slow, deliberate footsteps circling in the darkness, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting in the deep woods where people rarely go. Whatever it was, it changed something fundamental in how I see the world. Before that night, I thought I understood the hierarchy of the forest. Humans at the top, everything else below. Now, I'm not so sure now. I think maybe we're just visitors in places where other, older things still roam. And when we venture into their territory, sometimes they come to look at us, to understand what we are and why we're there. And sometimes they let us leave with nothing but a story no one will believe. Story 12. Our cousin. I've been debating whether to share this for years. Every time I start typing it out, I delete it all, but it's been almost 30 years now, and I still think about what happened almost weekly. Maybe getting it out will help, I don't know. This happened back in the fall of 1996, when I was 15. My dad took me on a hunting trip in northeastern Washington, near the Idaho border, not far from Sullivan Lake. We were after deer, which was pretty standard for us. Dad had been taking me hunting since I was 12, but this was my first time being allowed to carry my own rifle and actually hunt on my own. The area was typical Pacific Northwest wilderness, thick evergreen forests, rocky terrain, lots of underbrush, and pretty remote. We had to drive about an hour on Forest Service roads, then park and hike about 3 miles into the backcountry to set up our small camp. It was just a simple setup. 2 small tents, a basic fire pit, and our gear. Nothing fancy. Our first day out was completely uneventful. We hiked together, spotted some deer tracks and scat, but never got within shooting range of anything. That night at camp, Dad suggested we split up the next day to cover more ground. I remember feeling so proud that he trusted me enough to let me go on my own. We agreed to meet back at this distinctive rock outcropping about a mile from camp before dark. We both knew the area well enough. I'd been there multiple times with him, just never hunting on my own. The morning started like any other hunting day. We woke up before dawn, had a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee. I was allowed 1 cup, which made me feel grown up. We checked our gear, made sure we had our licenses, compasses, water, and enough food to last the day. I remember Dad giving me a pat on the shoulder before we headed in different directions. "Remember, Jacob," he said, "if you get a deer, field dress it and mark the location. Don't try dragging it back alone." Basic stuff I'd heard 100 times before. I headed northwest while Dad went northeast. The morning was crisp, probably in the low 40s, with a slight mist in the air that burned off as the sun rose higher. I moved slowly and deliberately, like Dad had taught me, stopping frequently to listen and scan the area around me. By mid-morning, I'd covered maybe 2 miles from our split point. That's when I came across this natural hollow in the terrain. It was like a shallow bowl, maybe 150 yards across, ringed by tall fir and cedar trees. The center was slightly marshy with these low, scrubby plants. I positioned myself at the edge of the hollow, on slightly higher ground that gave me a good vantage point. The perfect spot to wait and see if any deer came through. I remember checking my watch. It was around 10:30 in the morning. I'd been sitting there for maybe 15 minutes when I realized how quiet it had gotten. And I don't mean peaceful quiet. I mean that eerie, unnatural silence where you suddenly notice there are no birds calling, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush. Nothing. I remember getting this weird feeling at the back of my neck, like when you feel someone watching you. That's when I spotted movement on the far side of the hollow, maybe 60 yards away from my position. My first thought was, bear. We'd seen black bears in the area before. It was a dark shape moving in the lower part of the hollow. But something felt off right away. I raised my rifle, not to shoot, but to use the scope to get a better look. What I saw through that scope doesn't make any sense, even now. The bear was standing upright, but not like a bear does when it's curious about something. This thing was standing naturally upright, like that was its normal posture. Through the scope, I could see it was covered in dark reddish-brown hair. Not fur exactly, but more like hair. It looked like it had just risen from a crouched position. Then, I noticed two more similar creatures nearby, maybe 15 to 20 feet to the left and behind the first one. One was crouched low to the ground, almost on all fours, but not quite, while the third one was moving toward the first, walking on two legs but hunched over. They all had the same distinctive shape, big, with long arms that hung down past where their knees would be. They didn't have necks, not really. Their heads just kind of sloped back and sat low on their shoulders. The largest one was probably around 5 feet tall, with the others being shorter. One looked about 4 feet, and the smallest maybe 3.5 feet. They weren't bears. They weren't humans in suits. They moved with this fluid, purposeful motion that I can't really describe. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. I froze completely. I wasn't scared exactly, more like shocked into total stillness. I watched them through my scope for maybe 30 to 60 seconds as they moved across the open area. They stayed in this half-crouched position, keeping close to the brush whenever possible. Then they disappeared into the thicker trees on the opposite side of the hollow. I stayed completely still for another 10 minutes, expecting them to reappear. But they never did. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I remember my hands were shaking when I finally lowered the rifle. What the hell had I just seen? It wasn't bears, I was certain of that. Bears don't move like that. But they weren't people either. Not unless someone had brought 3 kids of different sizes into the middle of nowhere and dressed them in incredibly realistic costumes, which made no sense at all. I spent another hour in that spot, partly because I was still processing what I'd seen, and partly because I was honestly afraid to move. Eventually, I worked up the courage to leave, but I took a wide detour around the hollow, keeping to the trees and moving as quietly as possible. I kept looking back over my shoulder the entire time. I met up with Dad at the rock outcropping later that afternoon. He asked how my day went, and I just mumbled something about not seeing any deer. I couldn't tell him what I'd actually seen. I couldn't even process it myself, let alone explain it to someone else. Besides, I was 15. I was afraid he'd either think I was making it up for attention or that I'd somehow failed as a hunter by getting spooked in the woods. That night at camp, I barely slept. Every sound outside our tents made me tense up. The next morning, Dad suggested we hunt in the direction I'd gone the day before, since he hadn't had any luck in his area. I made up some excuse about wanting to try a different location. There was no way I was going back to that hollow. We spent 2 more days hunting before heading home. I didn't see anything unusual again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I'd catch myself scanning the tree line more than watching for deer. Dad noticed something was off and asked if I was feeling okay. I blamed it on being tired. For years, I never told anyone what I saw. How could I? It sounded crazy even to me, and I was the one who saw them. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just some weird trick of light and shadow, or that I'd somehow misinterpreted what I was seeing through the scope. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. Then, when I was in college, I stumbled across the Patterson-Gimlin film in one of my classes. The professor was using it as an example of cryptozoology and the scientific process. The moment I saw that footage, my blood ran cold. The way that creature moved in the film, that fluid, natural motion, it was exactly like what I'd seen in the woods that day. The proportions were similar too, though the creature in the film was much larger than the ones I saw. That's when it hit me. What if what I'd seen were juvenile Sasquatches, maybe even a family group? The more I've researched over the years, the more certain I've become. The unusual silence in the forest before the sighting. That's something many Bigfoot encounter reports mention. The way they moved, the proportions of their bodies, the fact that there were 3 of them of different sizes. It all fits with the idea of a family group of Sasquatch, maybe juveniles, that had separated briefly from an adult. I've gone back and forth over the years about whether to share this story. I have a professional career now, and the last thing I need is to be labeled as that Bigfoot guy. But the older I get, the less I care about what people think. I know what I saw. I had a clear view through a rifle scope in broad daylight. Those weren't bears, they weren't people, and they weren't any known animal that's supposed to exist in those woods. What bothers me most is that I didn't tell my dad when it happened. He passed away 5 years ago, and I never did work up the courage to tell him about it. I think he would have believed me. He was always more open-minded than I gave him credit for at 15, but now I'll never know. Sometimes I think about going back to that spot just to see if there's any sign of them still in the area. But part of me is afraid, not of seeing them again, but of not seeing anything and having to face the possibility that maybe, somehow, I imagined the whole thing. But I know I didn't. Those creatures were real. They were right there in front of me, going about their business, completely unaware that they were turning my understanding of the world upside down. It's been almost 30 years, and I still find myself scanning the tree line when I'm in the woods, hoping for another glimpse, but also kind of terrified of what might happen if I actually found one. Would anyone believe me? Would I be able to prove it? Or would I just end up as another person with an unbelievable story? I don't have any answers. All I have is what I saw that day. 3 hair-covered bipedal creatures moving through the wilderness in a way that no known animal moves. I've tried to explain it away 1,000 different ways, but I always come back to the same conclusion. There are things living in our forests that science hasn't documented yet. I haven't been hunting since my dad passed, partly because it's not the same without him, but also because every time I pick up a rifle and look through the scope, I'm back in that hollow, watching those creatures move across the open ground. Some things you just can't unsee. The weirdest part? I wasn't afraid while watching them. Shocked, yes. Confused, absolutely, but not scared. It was only afterward, when I started thinking about what I'd seen and what it meant, that the fear set in. Because if these creatures exist, and they've remained undiscovered despite all our technology and exploration, what else might be out there that we don't know about? I still have the same rifle. Sometimes I take it out of the safe, mount the same scope on it, and just look through it at the trees behind my house, not because I expect to see anything, but because it connects me to that moment. The moment when I realize the world is a much stranger place than we're taught to believe. I don't know what those creatures were doing in that hollow that day. I don't know where they went or if they're still out there. All I know is what I saw, and it changed me forever. Some people go their whole lives without having their reality challenged. I was 15 when it happened to me, and I've never been able to see the world the same way since. So that's my story. Make of it what you will. I'm not trying to convince anyone or prove anything. I just needed to finally get it out after all these years. Maybe someone else out there has seen something similar and is afraid to talk about it. If so, you're not alone, and you're not crazy. As for me, I still look up whenever I hear stories about Sasquatch or Bigfoot sightings. I still scan the tree line when I'm in the woods, and I still wonder about those 3 creatures I saw that fall day in 1996. Where are they now? Did they grow up? Are they still moving through those same forests, just out of sight, just beyond our understanding? I guess I'll never know. But I saw them. For just under a minute, our worlds overlapped, and nothing has ever been the same since. Story 13. I've been sitting on this experience for a while now, wondering if I should share it. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to tell someone what happened to me last October because it's been eating at me and I can't explain it. Maybe some of you have seen something similar. Last fall, I was staying at this small hunting cabin outside Oil City in western Pennsylvania. My sister had gone through a pretty rough surgery and I'd taken time off work to help her recover. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just the basics, you know. A bedroom, small kitchen, bathroom, living area with a fireplace. But it was clean and comfortable enough. The best part was the location. It backed right up to state game lands with nothing but trees and wilderness for miles. No neighbors, no noise except the sounds of the forest. Complete privacy. I had my dog Sadie with me, a shepherd mix who's about 5 years old. She's always been this super level-headed dog. Not much bothers her. She doesn't bark at strangers, doesn't get spooked by thunderstorms, nothing. I've had her since she was a puppy, and she's my hiking buddy wherever I go. Every morning around 7, Sadie and I would take this trail that started behind the cabin. It was a nice walk, maybe a 1.5 mile loop through the woods. We'd done it so many times that it felt completely routine. I knew every turn, every fallen log, every patch of mud we needed to step around. That morning, it was a Tuesday, I think, around the middle of October, started like any other. It was crisp, but not cold, maybe mid-40s. The leaves were changing, all those beautiful reds and yellows. The sun was up, but in the forest, it was still dim with that early morning light filtering through the trees. I remember I was wearing my green jacket, jeans, and hiking boots. Sadie was on her leash, but I was holding it loose since there was never anyone else around. We were about 5 minutes into our walk when Sadie's behavior changed. It was subtle at first. Her ears kept perking up, and she'd stop every few steps to look into the woods on our right side, down the slope. I didn't think much of it. Figured she was catching the scent of a deer or maybe a raccoon. But then she started walking closer to my leg, which wasn't like her at all. She usually stays a few feet ahead, eager to explore. I started paying more attention to her than to the trail. Her body language was off. The hair on her back wasn't raised yet, but she was tense. I could feel it through the leash. I stopped and scanned the area but didn't see anything unusual. Just trees and shadows. I remember thinking maybe there was a bear nearby. We'd seen them occasionally in that area. "What's up, girl?" I whispered, not wanting to break the morning quiet too much. She just looked at me, then back to the woods, then at me again. We continued walking, but she stayed glued to my side. About 2 minutes later, we'd gone maybe another 100 yards down the trail. Sadie just froze. I mean, completely stopped in her tracks like she'd hit an invisible wall. Her hackles shot up and her tail tucked between her legs. I've never seen her like that. She was staring down the slope to our right, into a thick patch of hemlock trees. She started trembling against my leg. That's when I felt it too, that feeling of being watched. My skin was instant goosebumps. I slowly turned my head to look where Sadie was staring, and at first I didn't see anything, just the dark green of the hemlocks against the lighter forest background. Then I saw it. Between two tree trunks, maybe 50 to 60 feet away, was something I still struggled to describe. It was massive and white, not pure white like snow, more like off-white or ivory with yellowish patches. At first, my brain tried to make it into something familiar, a weird-shaped tree, maybe a patch of fog, but then I realized it was standing perfectly upright, and it was solid. It was a figure, a massive, human-like figure, just standing there, perfectly still. The sun was hitting it from behind me, illuminating it against the shadows of the forest. That's probably the only reason I saw it at all. Its color stood out so starkly against the dark trees. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Time felt warped. I was trying to process what I was seeing. It was tall, really tall. I'm 5'6", and this thing towered over any human height. Had to be over 7 feet, probably closer to 8. Its torso was thick and powerful looking, not like a skinny tree trunk, but broad and substantial. The head seemed slightly pointed at the top, not dramatically, just not round like a human head. And its arms, God, the arms were long. They hung down way lower than a person's would, with the hands dangling below waist level. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, and it was partially shadowed by the trees, but I could tell it was watching us. I couldn't see eyes, but I could feel them on me. Sadie was trembling against my leg now, making these tiny whimpering sounds I'd never heard from her before. This dog, who fearlessly chases off coyotes from my parents' property, was terrified. I was too scared to move. I didn't have my phone out. It was in my jacket pocket, and I was afraid to reach for it. I didn't want to make any sudden movements. I just stood there, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then it moved. It didn't charge or do anything threatening. It just slowly turned its body and started walking away at an angle, heading downhill deeper into the forest. That movement is what convinced me it wasn't a tree or some weird light effect. The way it moved was unsettling. It was so fluid. Its stride was incredibly long, but not awkward looking. Its arms swung naturally at its sides as it walked, and it was quiet, unnervingly quiet for something that size moving through the forest. As it turned, I got a better look at its back. It was incredibly wide, much wider than any human back I've ever seen. And its fur or hair or whatever it was covering it wasn't uniform. In some places it was long and straight, in others matted or knotted together. The lower back and upper thighs had this darker discoloration, more of a dirty yellow color compared to the off-white of the rest of it. I watched it walk away until I couldn't see it anymore through the trees. It never looked back at us, never made a sound, just disappeared into the forest. Sadie and I stood frozen for what felt like forever. I was afraid to move, afraid it would come back if it heard us. Eventually, Sadie's body relaxed a little bit, though she was still on high alert. When she finally moved, she pulled hard toward the cabin, not forward on the trail, but back the way we'd come. I didn't argue. We practically jogged back, and I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time. When we got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind us and went straight to the windows to close all the blinds. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the cords. Sadie wouldn't leave my side for the rest of the day. She kept going to the windows and doors, listening intently. Every few minutes, her ears would perk up at sounds I couldn't hear. I called my sister and made up some excuse about needing to run errands just so I could drive into town and be around people. I didn't tell her what happened. She was recovering from surgery, and I didn't want to freak her out when she was alone in her house. Plus, what would I even say? Hey, I think I just saw Bigfoot, but it was white. She'd think I was losing it. For the rest of my stay, another 2.5 weeks, I never went back on that trail. I started taking Sadie on a different path that ran closer to the road, where there was less forest density, and I could see farther ahead. Even then, I only went when it was fully light out, and I was constantly scanning the trees. The nights were the worst. About 3 days after the sighting, I started hearing things outside the cabin after dark. Breaking branches. Something walking on the gravel path that led to the front door. One night around 2 in the morning, there was a thud against the side of the cabin that was so loud it woke me from a dead sleep. Sounded like something large had bumped against the wall. Sadie would go crazy, pacing and whining at the doors and windows. I'd shine a flashlight outside but never saw anything. I started sleeping with a kitchen knife next to my bed. 5 days before I was supposed to leave, I found something that made my blood run cold. It had rained the night before, and the ground was soft. Near the bottom of the steps leading up to the cabin door, there was a footprint. Not a boot print or a bare paw. A footprint. It was huge, much wider than my hiking boot, with what looked like 5 toes. The impression was deep, like whatever made it was incredibly heavy. I took a picture of it with a water bottle next to it for scale, but it doesn't show up well in the photo. By the afternoon, the sun had dried it out enough that it wasn't clearly visible anymore. When I got home, I started researching. I'd heard of Bigfoot, of course, but I'd always thought they were supposed to be dark-colored, brown or black. But when I started digging, I found other reports from Pennsylvania and the surrounding states describing white Sasquatches. Some people call them white things, or Pennsylvania white Bigfoot. The descriptions matched what I saw, the height, the long arms, the way it moved. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't the only one who'd seen something like this. It's been 6 months now, and I still think about it almost every day. The creature never did anything threatening. It walked away from us after all. But the encounter changed me. I don't hike alone in dense woods anymore. I never wear headphones on trails now. I need to hear what's around me. I carry a high-powered flashlight even during day hikes, and I recently bought a trail camera that I set up whenever I camp. The thing that stays with me most is the silence. How something that massive could move through the forest with barely a sound. And those proportions. No human is built like that, with those long arms and that wide back. I don't know what I saw that morning in the Pennsylvania woods. I can't explain it, and I don't expect anyone else to explain it either. But it was real. My dog saw it too, and she's not one to get spooked by nothing. Whatever it was out there, and for all I know, it's still roaming those game lands, watching hikers from between the trees. Sometimes I wonder if it knew we saw it, if it was studying us as much as we were studying it. And sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep and the wind is rustling the trees outside my window, I wonder if it followed me home. Story 14. I've held this in for so long, but I need to tell someone about this. It all happened in the summer of 1998. I was 11 years old, living with my parents on our small property near the Glass House Mountains in Queensland. Until now, I've only ever told my uncle about this, years later when I was 16. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that day. Our property wasn't huge, but it had a nice dam and backed onto bushland that seemed to go on forever. My parents both worked, and during school holidays I had lots of freedom to explore. They'd always just tell me, be home before dark and don't go past the dam. But kids don't always listen to those boundaries. January in Queensland is brutally hot. That particular day was sticky and humid, the kind where your shirt clings to your back within minutes of stepping outside. I remember finishing breakfast and telling Mum I was going exploring. She was busy getting ready for work and just reminded me to take water with me. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed in a water bottle, some biscuits, and headed out. Initially, I wasn't planning to go far, maybe just to the dam to catch some yabbies or look for turtles. It was something I'd done 100 times before. The dam was about 200 meters from our house. Nothing spectacular, just a big pond really, with some reeds growing around the edges. I hung around there for maybe half an hour, but nothing interesting was happening. No yabbies, no turtles, not even any interesting bugs. Beyond the dam was where the real bush started. There was a trail bike track that led into it, nothing official, just a path worn by local kids on their dirt bikes. I'd followed it a short distance before, but never very far on my own. That day, something pulled me forward. Maybe it was boredom, maybe curiosity, I don't know. The track wasn't difficult to follow. It wound through eucalyptus trees and past scratchy shrubs. Birds called overhead, and occasionally I'd hear rustling in the undergrowth from small animals. Nothing unusual for the Australian bush. The further I went, the more alive everything felt. Cicadas buzzed in an almost deafening chorus, and the smell of eucalyptus hung heavy in the air. I'd probably walked about a kilometer when something changed. I couldn't put my finger on what was different at first. The cicadas still buzzed, birds still called, but something felt off. Like when you think someone's watching you but don't know why. I stopped and took a swig from my water bottle, trying to shake the feeling. Looking around, everything appeared normal, but the feeling persisted, a prickling at the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. I decided to keep going, but more cautiously now. I started paying attention to every sound, every movement in the bush. About 5 minutes later, I heard it. Something moving parallel to the track off to my left. At first, I thought it might be a kangaroo. They're common enough in the area, but the rhythm was all wrong. Kangaroos have this distinctive hop. You can tell it's them even without seeing them. What I was hearing were footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like a person walking, but heavier. Too heavy for a human, and definitely not a pig or a dog either. Whatever it was, stayed about 20 or 30 meters away, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. My heart was already beating faster, but what happened next turned that nervous feeling into genuine fear. The sniffing started. Deep, powerful sniffs, like something was drawing air forcefully through its nose. Not quick little sniffs like a dog might make, but long, sustained inhalations. It sounded big, really big. I froze completely. My whole body went rigid with fear. The sniffing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then silence. Complete silence. Even the cicadas seemed to have gone quiet. I don't know what made me look in that direction, but I slowly turned my head toward where the sounds had come from. Through gaps in the dense vegetation, I could make out something dark and massive. It was standing upright behind a large eucalyptus tree, partially hidden. My first thought was that it was another kid playing a prank, maybe standing on someone's shoulders. But as my eyes focused, I realized this was way too big to be kids messing around. Whatever I was looking at stood at least 8 feet tall, towering higher than my dad, who's 6 foot and was the tallest person I knew at the time. I must have made some small sound or movement, because suddenly it stepped sideways from behind the tree, revealing itself more clearly. I still couldn't see every detail through the bushes, but what I could see was enough to make my blood run cold. It had a massive frame with wide shoulders, wider than any human I'd ever seen. Its arms were long, hanging down past where a person's would end. The chest was barrel-shaped and powerful. The whole body was covered in dark hair, maybe 4 or 5 inches long. Not shaggy or matted like you'd expect from something wild, but relatively smooth and uniform. When it moved, I could see its face wasn't fully covered in hair like the rest of its body. There were patches of exposed skin, a grayish-brown color, almost leathery looking. Its jaw was square and prominent, and its mouth was closed. I couldn't make out details of eyes or nose from that distance, but I could feel it staring directly at me. That's what struck me most. There was intelligence in how it watched me. It wasn't just an animal reacting to a human presence. It was observing me, studying me. I was completely frozen in place. I couldn't have run if I wanted to. The strangest part, I wasn't detecting any smell. I'd heard stories about these things having a powerful stench, but there was nothing like that, just the usual eucalyptus and bush smells. For what felt like ages, but was probably only 30 seconds or so, we just stared at each other. It made no sound, no growl, no vocalization at all. It wasn't acting threatening, but it wasn't retreating either. It was just acknowledging me. Then, without warning, it tilted its head slightly to one side, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. After a moment, it simply turned and walked deeper into the bush. Its movement surprisingly quiet for something so massive. Through gaps in the foliage, I could see glimpses of it moving away, walking upright the entire time, not dropping to all fours like a gorilla might. The moment it disappeared from sight, the spell broke. Pure adrenaline flooded my system. I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, back down the trail toward home. My lungs burned and branches whipped at my face and arms, but I didn't slow down for a second. I remember looking back over my shoulder several times, half expecting to see it pursuing me, but there was nothing there, just the empty trail behind me. Somehow, that almost made it worse, the idea that it could be following silently just out of sight. I covered that kilometer back to the dam in what felt like seconds. My legs were on autopilot, fueled by a primal fear I'd never experienced before or since. When I finally reached the cleared area around our property, I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for breath. Walking the last bit to our house, I tried to process what had just happened. Was it a person in a costume? No way. Nobody could fake that size and movement so convincingly, especially not in the middle of nowhere on a scorching January day. Was it some kind of escaped zoo animal? That didn't make any sense either. When I got home, I didn't tell my parents. I knew how it would sound, like a kid with an overactive imagination making up stories. Instead, I went straight to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and tried to calm down. That night at dinner, Dad asked if I'd had a good day exploring. I just nodded and said I'd hung around the dam. I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they would, and then we'd have to move. I loved our property and didn't want to leave because of something that had shown me no actual aggression. For weeks afterward, I stayed close to the house. When I did venture out, I never went past the dam again. I kept looking at the tree line, half expecting to see it standing there watching me, but I never did. It wasn't until 5 years later that I finally told someone. My Uncle Dave was visiting, and we were sitting on the back porch one evening while my parents were inside. He was telling me about strange things he'd seen while working as a park ranger, and something about his matter-of-fact way of talking about unexplained phenomena made me feel safe to share. When I finished telling him what happened, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just nodded slowly and said, "That sounds like a Yowie encounter." He explained that there had been similar reports from around the Glasshouse Mountains area for years. People seeing large, hairy, bipedal creatures that didn't fit any known species. Looking back now, what strikes me most about the encounter was how deliberate it felt. This wasn't a random animal that stumbled across a human and reacted. It felt like it had been tracking me, maybe watching me for some time before deciding to reveal itself. The way it just stood there made sure I saw it, then calmly walked away. It was almost like it wanted me to know it existed. I've thought a lot about why it showed itself to me. Was it curious about the human kid wandering alone in the bush? Was it some kind of warning to stay away from its territory? Or was it something else entirely? I'll never know. What I do know is that whatever I saw that day was real. It wasn't a hallucination or my imagination running wild. It was a physical, living creature that doesn't fit into our understanding of what exists in the Australian bush. I'm 36 now, and I've never had another experience like it. I've gone hiking and camping many times as an adult, but nothing has ever given me that same feeling of being in the presence of something that shouldn't exist according to science. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just a bizarre misunderstanding, maybe a very tall person in dark clothes that my young mind transformed into something more fantastic. But then I remember the proportions, the movement, the intelligence in how it observed me, and I know what I saw wasn't human. The memories haven't faded with time. If anything, they've become clearer as I've gotten older and learned more about Yowie sightings across Australia. I still remember every detail, the humid air, the silence that fell over the bush, the precise way it stepped from behind that tree. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Most people won't, but I know what I saw that day, and it fundamentally changed how I view the world. There are things out there we don't understand, living alongside us, occasionally crossing paths with humans who venture into their domain. Sometimes I drive past our old property when I'm in the area. The house is still there, though different people live in it now. I always slow down and look toward the tree line beyond the dam. Part of me wonders if it's still out there, still watching, still choosing when to be seen and when to remain hidden in the ancient Australian bush. Story 15. I've never really talked about this with anyone outside my sister. For the longest time, I couldn't bring myself to share it because I was afraid people would think I was making it up or that I was crazy. But after hearing other people's stories from the same area, I feel like maybe it's time to talk about what happened to my sister and me back in the summer of 1995. I was 10 years old at the time. My sister Emma was 12. We lived in rural Oregon, about 20 miles outside of Portland, in a small house that backed up to hundreds of acres of forest. Our parents both worked long hours, and this was before the days of helicopter parenting, so we had a lot of freedom to explore the woods. We knew every trail, creek, and landmark within about a mile of our property. That summer was unusually dry. The creek we usually played in, Pinecrest Creek we called it, was almost completely dried up, just a trickle really. We'd been going stir-crazy at home because it was hot and there wasn't much to do. Emma suggested we follow the creek bed further than we usually went to see if there was still water upstream. I remember it was a Wednesday because Mom had left us sandwiches in the fridge with a note saying she'd be home late because of her Wednesday meeting. We packed the sandwiches, some apples and water bottles into our backpacks and headed out right after breakfast. The day started out normally enough. We followed the familiar path down to the creek, then started walking along the nearly dry creek bed. The rocks were exposed, making it easy to hop from one to another. I remember thinking it was like a natural stepping stone path leading us deeper into the forest. We must have walked for at least 2 hours. Emma kept a better pace than me, and I remember feeling a bit annoyed that she kept getting ahead. "Wait up!" I called out, probably a dozen times. The forest around us was different than what we were used to. The trees seemed taller, the undergrowth thicker, but it was exciting to see new territory, like we were real explorers. Around noon, we stopped to eat our sandwiches on a large, flat rock next to what was left of the creek. The water was a bit deeper here, maybe 6 inches, and clearer than where it ran by our house. We took off our shoes and dangled our feet in the cool water while we ate. "I think we should head back soon," Emma said as she finished her sandwich. I agreed, but suggested we go just a little further to see what was around the bend ahead of us. She hesitated, but then nodded. That decision changed everything. As we rounded the bend, the creek bed widened into a small clearing. There were fallen logs covered in moss and a cluster of large boulders on the far side. The area was unusually quiet. That's what I noticed first, the silence. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the bushes, just complete stillness. I was looking down at the rocks, trying not to trip, when Emma suddenly stopped walking. Her hand shot out to block me from going any further. When I looked up at her face, her eyes were wide and her mouth was slightly open. She wasn't blinking, just staring straight ahead. I followed her gaze across the clearing to the tree line on the other side. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just trees and shadows. Then something moved, or rather, adjusted its position. It was trying to hide behind a massive Douglas fir, but it was too big to be completely concealed. What I saw next is burned into my memory forever. It was a massive figure, hunched awkwardly, as if trying to make itself smaller. It was covered in thick, dark brown hair. Not fur exactly, but more like long hair that hung in matted clumps. The color wasn't uniform. It was darker on top and lighter on the limbs. Its proportions were all wrong. The arms were unnaturally long, hanging almost to the knees. The shoulders were incredibly broad and looked powerful, even from where we stood. The head sat directly on those shoulders, with barely any neck visible. But the face, what I could see of it, is what made my blood run cold. It had deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. They were dark, but I couldn't tell the color from that distance. The face looked almost human-like, but also not. Almost like a very primitive version of a human face, if that makes sense. It was watching us. Not moving, not making a sound, just watching. I could feel it studying us with an intelligence that seemed impossible for an animal. Emma's hand found mine and squeezed so hard it hurt. Neither of us spoke. I don't think we even breathed for several seconds. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emma began to step backward, pulling me along with her. We moved slowly, afraid any sudden movement might provoke whatever it was. As we backed away, I noticed movement behind the large creature. A smaller figure emerged slightly from the vegetation. This one was shorter, maybe 5 feet tall, with a reddish-brown tint to its hair. It moved with more curiosity than caution, peering around the larger one's side. A juvenile, a child. My mind made the connection instantly, though I couldn't fully process what I was seeing. The larger one, the adult, extended its arms slightly, as if to keep the younger one back. The gesture was so human, so protective, that for a moment I felt a strange connection to these creatures. They were a family, just like my sister and me. We continued backing away until we reached the bend in the creek. The adult creature never moved from its spot, but its eyes followed our every movement. Once we were around the bend and out of its sight, Emma whispered, "Run!" We ran faster than I've ever run in my life, stumbling over rocks, splashing through shallow water, scrambling up the banks when the creek bed became too difficult to navigate. We didn't stop until our lungs were burning and our legs were shaking. When we finally paused to catch our breath, Emma looked at me with wild eyes. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. "We can't tell Mom and Dad," she said firmly. "They won't believe us. They'll think we're making it up, or they'll be scared and never let us go into the woods again." I agreed, though part of me desperately wanted to tell someone, anyone, about what we'd seen. But Emma was right. Who would believe 2 kids claiming they'd seen Bigfoot? The walk home was a blur. We kept looking over our shoulders, jumping at every snapped twig or rustling leaf. When we finally reached our backyard, it felt like crossing a finish line to safety. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, intelligent eyes staring back at me. I kept hearing noises outside my window, branches scraping against the glass, the wind whistling through the trees. But there was one sound that wasn't typical, a deep, rhythmic whooping noise that came from the edge of the forest. It happened 3 times, then stopped. I pulled the covers over my head and squeezed my eyes shut. The next morning, Emma came into my room early. "Did you hear it last night?" she whispered. I nodded. "I looked out my window," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "I didn't see anything, but I heard branches breaking, like something heavy was moving through the trees." "Do you think it followed us home?" I asked, my voice small. Emma shook her head. "No, I think it was just, I don't know, marking its territory or something, making sure we knew to stay away. We kept our secret for years. We still went into the woods, but never as far as we had that day. And we always stayed together, always alert. Sometimes we'd find odd tracks in mud near the creek, huge footprints that were too big to be human, but shaped wrong to be a bear. Once we found a small tree bent over in a peculiar way, creating an arch that seemed deliberately formed rather than natural. It wasn't until I was in college, almost 12 years later, that I first heard about other Bigfoot sightings in our area. Emma and I were home for Christmas, and a local news story mentioned a hiker who claimed to have seen a large, hair-covered bipedal creature near Pinecrest Creek. The description matched what we had seen perfectly. That night, for the first time, Emma and I talked openly about our experience with our parents. They were skeptical but didn't dismiss us outright. Dad mentioned that when they first bought the house, an old neighbor had warned them about forest people that lived deep in the woods. I've researched countless Bigfoot sightings since then, and many details from other encounters match what we experienced. The unusual silence in the forest, the protective behavior, the whooping calls at night. I've never gone public with our story until now, partly out of fear of ridicule, partly because that experience feels intensely personal. I'm 38 now, with kids of my own. We live in the city, but we visit my parents at their house a few times a year. My children love playing in the woods, but I never let them go as far as Emma and I did. Sometimes, when everyone else is asleep, I sit on the back porch and listen to the forest. Most nights, it's just the usual sounds, owls hooting, the wind in the trees. But sometimes, on rare occasions, I hear that deep, rhythmic whooping sound coming from deep within the darkness. And I know they're still out there, that forest family, watching and waiting, protecting their territory just as they did when I was a child. I still feel that connection to them sometimes, that strange moment of recognition when the adult protected its child, just as my sister protected me. They weren't monsters. They were just another family, living their lives in the forest, wanting to be left alone. To this day, I've never been able to explain exactly what Emma and I saw. But I know what we experienced was real. Those eyes, that intelligence, that deliberate movement. It wasn't a bear or a man in a suit or a trick of the light. It was something else entirely, something that doesn't fit into our understanding of what lives in the forests around us. I'm still cautious when I'm in the woods. I still listen for unusual silence, still look for movement at the tree line. Some experiences change you forever, and coming face to face with those creatures is one I'll never forget, even though it lasted only a few minutes on an otherwise ordinary summer day when I was 10 years old.